I have always believed that the NFL is more than a game. It is spectacle and tradition, grit and glory. It is Sunday afternoons carved into the American calendar. Thanksgiving tables paused as televisions flicker with battles of will and skill. But behind the touchdowns and highlight reels, beneath the chants of fans who pour their devotion into colors and crests, there exists another story. It is quieter, colder, and far more consequential than anything that happens between the painted sidelines. It is the story of how billionaires in suits, sitting far from the roar of the crowd, determined the fate of the league, its players, and its cities through deals the public was never meant to fully see. This is where the shadows of football live, not in the locker rooms or on the practice fields, but in boardrooms where a handshake could uproot an entire franchise. In smoke-filled rooms where alliances were struck, betrayals unfolded, and money changed hands faster than the ball on a kickoff return. These were not the huddles you saw on television. These were the huddles that rewrote maps, rewrote contracts, and rewrote the very nature of loyalty itself. The NFL's history is defined not only by dynasties and championships, but also by relocations, lawsuits, and lockouts. These moments were not born from the will of coaches or the strength of players, but from the calculated decisions of men who owned the game's very foundation. Men who saw football not as passion, but as product. To them, the field was not a battlefield, but a marketplace. The fans were not believers, but consumers. The players were not heroes, but investments. Consider Cleveland in 1995, a city with decades of loyalty to its Browns. Families had passed down season tickets like heirlooms, fathers and mothers teaching their children to live and die with every snap. Yet in one stunning announcement, that bond was severed. Owner Art Modell, facing financial pressures and lured by promises of a new stadium deal, Hugh declared he was moving the Browns to Baltimore. It was a decision made in secret, negotiated far from the chants of the dog pound. The people of Cleveland were left betrayed, their loyalty weaponized against them. As Modell said of his decision, this was not about love, it was about survival. But for the city, it was about heartbreak. That was not an isolated story. It was a pattern. From Baltimore losing the Colts in the dead of night to Los Angeles being stripped of its teams for decades. From St. Louis gaining a team only to lose it again. The NFL's geography has long been a chessboard moved by owners who calculated risk and reward in pursuit of profit. Every relocation deal was more than a business decision. It was a lesson in power. Owners could bend cities to their will, demanding taxpayer-funded stadiums under threat of departure. They could pit one region against another, forcing local governments to compete for the privilege of being home to the Shield. Even beyond stadium politics, the dirty deals of owners have shaped how the game itself is played. Television contracts negotiated by a handful of men in the mid-20th century transformed the NFL into a national empire. The AFL and FL merger of 1970 was less about athletic competition and more about owners negotiating monopoly control. When networks paid billions for broadcast rights, it wasn't players cashing in, it was owners, consolidating power and revenue streams that dwarfed anything the athletes themselves could ever dream of. Behind every collective bargaining agreement, every lockout, every strike was an owner's agenda. In 1987, when players walked out demanding free agency and better pay, the owners orchestrated a replacement player season, undermining the very union that fought for fairness. Decades later, in 2011, they locked the players out again. This time to secure a more favorable revenue split that protected their billions, even as athletes faced shorter careers and lasting physical consequences. As NFLPA Director DeMaurice Smith put it during that lockout, this is not about football. This is about power. And power has always been the real prize. Take Jerry Jones, the Dallas Cowboys owner who reshaped how sponsorships and media deals were structured. His clash with league leadership exposed fractures within the billionaire fraternity itself. as owners competed not only against players, but against one another for control of the money machine. When Jones defied tradition, he revealed a truth the league could not hide. The Shield is not a united front, but a collection of individual empires, sometimes at war behind closed doors. The dark side of these deals is not just financial, it is cultural. Fans believe in legacy, in tradition, in permanence. Yet time and again, owners have revealed how fragile that permanence truly is. A team is not bound to a city. It is bound to a contract. A dynasty is not guaranteed by wins. It is secured by revenues. A stadium is not a monument to history. It is collateral in a negotiation. These stories are not comfortable to tell because they reveal the truth about a game we love. That truth is simple. Football's soul has always been balanced against its bottom line. For every touchdown that electrifies a crowd, there is a ledger where the ink is measured in millions. For every Lombardi trophy lifted under falling confetti, there is a deal signed that ensured who profited from the spectacle. The NFL markets itself as unity. Players locking arms, fans wearing the same jerseys, communities rallying around their teams. But in reality, the league is unity only when convenient. When profit is threatened, loyalty is negotiable. Cities can be discarded, traditions can be rewritten, and promises can be broken. The deals struck by owners often in silence, often without public knowledge, have carved scars into the league's history that no highlight reel can erase. And yet, that is precisely why this story matters. Because to understand the NFL, you cannot simply watch the games. You must listen for the silence between them. You must look past the cheers and see the contracts. You must recognize that the league's greatest plays often took place not on the gridiron, but at the negotiation table. The NFL's dirty deals are its hidden legacy, shaping the league in ways fans rarely realize. This is the story of power dressed as entertainment, of billionaires who played behind the scenes, rewriting the rules of loyalty, geography, and even competition itself. This is the story of the hidden game. When we talk about the National Football League, the images that come to mind are often rooted in tradition and spectacle. Roaring stadiums under the floodlights, championship banners hanging in the rafters, and Sundays where millions of Americans gather to witness drama unfold on the field. But to understand the NFL in its entirety, one must go deeper, beyond the helmets, beyond the huddles, beyond the final score. The true engine of this league is not found on the turf. It hums quietly in boardrooms, in private clubs, in legal documents signed behind closed doors. It is driven not by quarterbacks or linebackers, but by owners, billionaires, and power brokers who shape the very direction of professional football with decisions that ripple far beyond the gridiron. The theme of this story is simple, yet unsettling. The NFL is not just a sport. It is a business empire, controlled by men who have mastered the art of influence. For every touchdown that excites fans, there is a hidden negotiation that determined which city the touchdown would happen in, which network would broadcast it, and how much profit it would generate for those at the top. The players may provide the spectacle, but it is the owners who control the stage. And history shows us, time and again, that their decisions have not always been pure. They have been calculated, self-serving, and often ruthless. To see the NFL clearly, we must first see the owners clearly. They are not coaches on the sidelines. They are not players risking their bodies. And they are not fans carrying the lifelong devotion of a community. They are businessmen, operating within a billionaire's fraternity. They gather not in locker rooms, but in luxury suites and board meetings, where competition takes a different shape. Their victories are not measured in touchdowns, but in television contracts, taxpayer subsidies, and relocation victories. Their losses are not on the scoreboard, but in failed lawsuits, broken alliances, and the occasional fall from grace. The culture of ownership in the NFL was shaped from its earliest days. In the 1920s and 30s, teams were fragile ventures, often collapsing under financial strain. The men who kept them alive were entrepreneurs, willing to take risks, but always focused on profitability. The Great Depression forced owners to improvise, to negotiate new rules of survival. Out of this environment came the realization that football could thrive only if the men at the top controlled the business as tightly as possible. This ethos never left the league. If anything, it grew stronger as football became a national obsession. By the 1960s, the NFL's dirty deals began to crystallize into a pattern. Consider the television revolution. Pete Rozelle, the commissioner at the time, persuaded owners to pool their broadcast rights and sell them collectively. It was a brilliant move, ensuring that every team, large or small market, benefited from television revenue. But it also consolidated power in the hands of owners, who suddenly found themselves in possession of a golden goose. TV contracts became their lifeblood, and networks became their bargaining chips. The players on the field generated the entertainment, but the owners who struck those deals controlled the money. It was not long before money reshaped loyalty. Teams that had been fixtures in their communities for decades suddenly became mobile assets. Baltimore learned this in 1984, when Colts owner Robert Irsay moved the franchise to Indianapolis overnight. The city woke up to an empty stadium, its team stolen away by a decision made in secrecy. The heartbreak of Baltimore's fans mattered little compared to the financial incentives offered in Indianapolis. It was a dirty deal in every sense, a betrayal cloaked as business. This kind of maneuvering would repeat itself. Art Modell's decision to move the Browns from Cleveland to Baltimore in 1995 is one of the most infamous examples. Modell framed it as necessary for the franchise's survival, but to the city of Cleveland, it felt like robbery. Their loyalty, their identity, was sacrificed for a stadium deal and promises of financial stability. Journalist Tony Grossi, who covered the Browns extensively, described the move as a civic tragedy disguised as sports news. And he was right, the wound it left on Cleveland has never fully healed. These stories illustrate a deeper truth. In the NFL, loyalty is negotiable. Cities and fans are bargaining chips. Stadiums are leverage points. Politicians are pressured to allocate billions of taxpayer dollars to fund arenas that benefit private owners. "Build us a new stadium or we leave" became the unspoken threat that echoed across America. In many cases, cities folded, handing over public money to billionaires because the fear of losing a team was too devastating to bear. The dirty deals of the NFL were not always backroom betrayals. Sometimes they were public extortion, played out on the civic stage. The labor battles tell a similar story. In 1987, when players went on strike, owners hired replacement players to keep the games going. It was a calculated move that crushed the momentum of the players' union. Former defensive end Reggie White, one of the strike's most vocal supporters, said at the time, "We're fighting for fairness, but fairness doesn't exist in their vocabulary." The 2011 lockout followed the same pattern, with owners holding out until they secured a financial structure that guaranteed them a larger share of the billions flowing into the league. Players were forced to choose between financial hardship and returning under terms dictated from above. Once again, the scoreboard was not about wins or losses, it was about leverage. What makes these deals particularly dirty is not only their financial nature, but their human cost. Players suffer shortened careers, broken bodies, and long-term health risks. Cities are left saddled with debt from stadium projects that enrich private owners but provide little economic return. Fans, the most loyal participants in the NFL machine, are treated as endlessly replaceable. Their loyalty is counted on, but rarely respected. The NFL thrives on passion, but the owners thrive on calculation. That contradiction lies at the heart of this story. Even within the billionaire fraternity, there are fractures. Jerry Jones's rise in Dallas reshaped the business of the NFL, as he pursued independent sponsorship deals and challenged traditional revenue-sharing structures. His defiance sparked tensions with fellow owners, revealing that the league is not one unified family, but a collection of empires, each with its own ambitions. Daniel Snyder's troubled tenure in Washington, rife with lawsuits and investigations, showed what happens when ownership crosses the line from ruthless to reckless. These case studies remind us that the dirty deals of the NFL are not limited to cities and players, they extend to the very relationships between owners themselves. The scope of this documentary is to peel back those layers, to examine how these men shaped the game, not through playbooks or draft picks, but through negotiations, threats, and deals made behind closed doors. It will take us from the early years of the league's formation through the television era that turned it into America's most lucrative sport, through the relocations and labor battles that defined its modern history, and into the ongoing power struggles that still shape the NFL today. We will see how loyalty was tested and broken, how money outweighed tradition, and how power became the true prize of the National Football League. We will hear the voices of those who lived through it, players betrayed by broken promises, journalists who exposed the backroom dealings, and fans who carried the emotional cost of decisions made in boardrooms. We will analyze the statistics, the contracts, and the billions that changed hands. Most importantly, we will reflect on what it all means for the game, for the players, and for the millions who love it. Because the NFL is more than sport. It is a story about America's obsession with power, wealth, and spectacle. It is a mirror held up to our culture, showing us how far people will go to control something beloved. The dirty deals of its owners are not just a subplot. They are the main story that explains why the league looks the way it does today. This journey will not always be comfortable. It will challenge the myths we tell about football as pure and timeless. But it will be necessary. Because to truly understand the NFL, we must understand the men who play behind the scenes. When I think of the NFL today, I see billion-dollar stadiums shimmering like monuments, massive television contracts stretching across decades, and owners whose names carry the weight of empires. But it wasn't always this way. To understand how the NFL's dirty deals took root, we need to return to the fragile beginnings when professional football was less a national religion and more a struggling pastime stitched together by men whose motives were rarely about sport and almost always about control. The 1920s were the cradle of professional football. At that time, the game lived in the shadow of baseball, which dominated the American imagination. The National Football League, founded in 1920 as the American Professional Football Association, was hardly a polished product. Teams came and went with dizzying frequency. Owners were often local businessmen, car salesmen, factory managers, tavern operators, men with modest capital who saw football less as a national endeavor and more as a way to attract crowds to their businesses. But even then, the seeds of power were present. Whoever controlled the teams controlled the league, and whoever controlled the league controlled the future of the sport. From the very start, ownership was about survival. Unlike today's billionaires, early owners weren't guaranteed profits. Crowds were small, revenues inconsistent, and the risks enormous. Teams like the Akron Pros, Canton Bulldogs, and Dayton Triangles faded into obscurity because the men behind them couldn't sustain the costs. But among those fragile ventures, a few owners stood out not because of wealth alone, but because of vision. They understood that while the players provided the action, the real strength of the league would always rest in the hands of those who managed the business. One of the earliest power figures was George Halas, founder of the Chicago Bears. Halas wasn't merely a coach or promoter. He was an operator who grasped the necessity of shaping rules and revenue to favor long-term survival. By moving his team from Decatur to Chicago, he positioned the Bears in a major market. A decision that reflected a pattern we would see repeated again and again. Owners exploiting geography as leverage. Halas helped craft the league's image, but more importantly, he helped create the structures that ensured ownership would remain the beating heart of the NFL. The league's first major deal came in the form of centralization. In 1926, after rival leagues threatened its stability, the NFL recognized the need for unified authority. Owners came together, agreeing on rules and consolidating schedules. This wasn't just about football. It was about eliminating competition, ensuring that their collective control would remain unchallenged. Already, the pattern was clear. Owners looked outwardly united while internally battling for dominance, always with an eye on financial survival. By the 1930s, the NFL was still fragile, but the power of ownership was solidifying. Owners realized that they could dictate terms not only to players, but also to cities. The Great Depression magnified these dynamics. Fans had little disposable income, and teams folded with regularity. Yet, it was in these desperate times that owners discovered the power of exclusivity. Teams that survived did so by creating scarcity-limiting franchises, raising the value of entry, and negotiating collectively. It was an early version of the cartel mindset that defines the league to this day. The first dirty deals were often simple but effective. Owners colluded to keep players' salaries low, refusing to bid competitively for talent. They created the reserve clause, binding players to their teams indefinitely, stripping athletes of freedom while protecting ownership costs. For players, football was grueling labor with little security. For owners, it was leverage, a reminder that the league existed on their terms, not the players. That imbalance of power established in the league's infancy would shape decades of conflict to come. One of the clearest examples of early owner influence came in 1932, when the NFL staged its first playoff game between the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans. That matchup wasn't just about crowning a champion. It was a calculated decision by owners to manufacture spectacle, to sell more tickets, and to build a product that could compete with baseball. The very format of football, from playoffs to championship games, was born not from athletic purity, but from business strategy. Every structural change was, at its core, a deal. The owners of the 1940s and 50s inherited this foundation and pushed it further. As the league grew, so did the stakes. Wealthier men entered the fraternity, transforming ownership from a risky side hustle into a potential gold mine. Stadium deals became more prominent. Owners learned they could pressure local governments into providing land or subsidies, threatening relocation if demands weren't met. While early teams were small businesses, by mid-century they were becoming civic assets that owners could weaponize. This period also introduced the first great rival to the NFL, the All-America Football Conference, or AFC, founded in 1946. Teams like the Cleveland Browns, under Paul Brown's revolutionary leadership, proved that rival leagues could attract talent and fan interest. But rather than risk losing their grip, NFL owners orchestrated a merger, absorbing some AAFC teams while eliminating others. It was an early masterstroke in monopolization. It's a kind of deal that would later repeat in the AFL and FL merger of 1970. The lesson was clear. When challenged, owners didn't simply compete, they consolidated, buying out rivals to preserve their power. The dirty deals of these early decades might not have looked as grand as today's billion-dollar contracts, but they carried the same DNA. Manipulation of markets, suppression of labor, backroom negotiations that prioritized ownership over all else. The narrative of the league's growth is often told through heroic players and iconic games. But the truth is that the league survived and thrived because owners continually struck deals to ensure their dominance. And while these deals brought stability, they also planted seeds of mistrust that would later explode. Players began to realize their lack of rights. Cities learned that teams could vanish if owners saw greener pastures elsewhere. Fans discovered that their devotion was not always reciprocated. Yet, in those formative years, the imbalance of power was accepted as natural. Owners were kings, and everyone else was expected to bow to their decisions. Looking back, I see those decades not just as the birth of the NFL, but as the birth of a system in which business came first, and the game followed. A system in which the men in suits could rewrite rules, erase teams, and redefine competition itself with little accountability. It was here, in the fragile early years, that the dark undercurrent of ownership was established. By the time the league reached the 1960s, the foundation was set. Television was about to transform football into America's #1 sport, and owners were ready to cash in. But television money would not just enrich the game, it would amplify the very dynamics that began in those early decades. Owners would become richer, their influence deeper, and their deals dirtier. What started as tavern owners and car salesmen running small-town teams had evolved into billionaires preparing to strike national contracts. The stakes had changed, but the core principle had not. In the NFL, power does not reside on the field. It resides behind the scenes, with the men willing to make the deals that others wouldn't. This is where the story turns, from survival to expansion, from fragile beginnings to television riches. The owners of the NFL prepared to leverage their growing influence into something unprecedented. The league was no longer simply a pastime. It was a business empire waiting to be built, and the next dirty deals would be bigger than anything the sport had ever seen. I've always believed that the story of the NFL can be told just by looking at the players on the field. To understand its power, its corruption, its brilliance, and its betrayals, you have to follow the owners. Because it was never just a game of football. It was a game of leverage, of cities, of politicians, and of secret deals that rarely saw the light of day. And when I think about the clearest examples of that, two names stand out in opposite ways but tied by the same thread: Al Davis and Art Modell. Davis and Modell could not have been more different. One was the renegade, the outsider with slicked-back hair, sunglasses, and a Brooklyn accent sharp enough to cut through steel. The other was the polished insider, charming and businesslike, playing the gentleman role until the knife came out. And yet, in their own ways, both men revealed the darker truth about NFL ownership, that the Shield wasn't built on unity, but on power struggles and betrayal. Let's start with Davis. To tell his story is to tell the story of rebellion. Al Davis was never content with being just another name on the owner's roll call. He was brash, he was calculating, and he carried himself as if the league was his to bend. When he took over the Oakland Raiders in the 1960s, he built a team that mirrored his personality. Tough, ruthless, built for intimidation. But Davis's fight wasn't just on the field. It was in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in closed-door meetings where the NFL owners wanted conformity, and Davis gave them defiance. In the late 1970s, when Davis wanted to move the Raiders from Oakland to Los Angeles, the NFL blocked him. The other owners saw his ambition as reckless, destabilizing, but Davis didn't fold. He sued the league. In a federal antitrust case, he put the NFL itself on trial, and in 1982, he won. The Raiders moved to Los Angeles, and suddenly the Shield wasn't invincible. Davis had cracked it open. He once said, "The NFL is not a church, it's a business, and I'll run mine the way I see fit." That quote summed him up. Davis exposed the league as carefully polished image for what it really was, a cartel of businessmen fighting for their share. But if Davis was the rebel who challenged the system, Art Modell was the opposite, the consummate insider who played within it until it no longer suited him. Modell wasn't flashy. He didn't crave the spotlight the way Davis did. Instead, he thrived in the back rooms, on the committees, in the places where the real deals were made. He was instrumental in pushing the NFL toward television contracts, in helping merge the AFL and NFL into one unified league. For years, he was respected as one of the league's pillars. And yet, Modell became infamous, not for building the NFL, but for tearing a city apart. In 1995, he did what fans in Cleveland still describe as betrayal of the highest order. He secretly negotiated to move the Browns, one of the most storied franchises in football, to Baltimore. For months, he denied it, telling Cleveland fans the team isn't going anywhere. And then, in November of that year, he announced the deal. Overnight, Cleveland lost its team. The city was devastated. Fans burned his effigy in the streets. One newspaper headline simply read, "The Move." The difference between Davis and Modell is striking. Davis fought the NFL itself, forcing the league to bend to his will. Modell, on the other hand, worked with the league, used its blessing, and still managed to stab an entire city in the back. In Davis's case, fans often saw him as a rebel hero, a man standing up to the cartel. He was the villain. The owner who proved loyalty had a price tag. But when you strip back the emotion, both stories reveal the same truth. The NFL's destiny has always been shaped by owners playing their own games behind the curtain. Davis's lawsuits opened the door for franchises to relocate whenever the money was right. Modell's betrayal showed that no tradition, no history, no loyalty to a community was safe if the bottom line demanded something else. Think about the irony. Al Davis, the outlaw, made it easier for men like Art Modell to do what they did. By breaking the NFL's control over team movement, he set the precedent. And Modell, the establishment man, used that very precedent to move his team under the cover of secrecy. One rebel, one insider, both pulling at the same threads of a system that claimed to be built on unity, but was actually fractured by self-interest. The human toll of these moves was staggering. In Los Angeles, Raiders fans celebrated Davis's victory, but Oakland felt abandoned. In Cleveland, Modell's name became synonymous with betrayal, but Baltimore celebrated the return of football with open arms. Cities were pawns, fans were collateral damage, and owners played chess with lives and legacies. Looking back, it's clear to me that these two men weren't just owners. They were architects of the league's darker side. Davis proved that the NFL could be beaten. Modell proved that fans could be sacrificed. And together, their legacies remind us that the Shield was never about protecting the game. It was about protecting the business. In the end, Davis carried his defiance to the grave. His Raiders remained symbols of rebellion, silver and black against the world. Modell, meanwhile, died in 2012, still haunted by the hatred of Cleveland, still unable to escape the label of traitor. Two men who walked different paths, but whose choices revealed the same ugly truth: that the NFL's greatest games were indeed played on Sundays, but in the shadows, where owners wrote the real rules. And when I think about the phrase, dirty deals, I think about Davis sitting across from league lawyers in a courtroom, smirking as he tore their case apart. I think about Modell sitting with Baltimore officials in secret meetings, plotting a move while telling Cleveland he was staying. Different styles, same result. Power at any cost. That's the duality of NFL ownership. One man shouts it from the rooftops, another whispers it in the dark, but both leave scars that never heal. And so, as we continue this journey into the hidden world of the NFL's power brokers, we move from the contrasting legacies of Davis and Modell to the wider reality of how these dirty deals became the very foundation of the league's modern empire. I remember the moment the NFL truly stopped being just a sport. It wasn't a game or a championship, or even a dynasty that made the difference. It was a contract, a deal written in ink, but carried on the invisible waves of television broadcast. For the first time, ball wasn't confined to stadiums filled with 50 or 60,000 people, was beamed into millions of homes. Living rooms turned into miniature arenas. Families gathered around black and white screens, watching giants collide. And behind that miracle of access, behind that national communion, were men in boardrooms, owners who understood that television wasn't just a tool, it was power. By the late 1950s, the NFL had grown from a rough regional pastime into a respectable professional league. But respectable didn't pay bills the way television could. Owners had always worried about empty seats, rainy Sundays, or losing records that kept fans away. Television promised consistency. Revenue, whether the stadium was full or not. Reach into cities where no franchise existed. And perhaps most importantly, it promised leverage over players, over fans, even over each other. I think often about Pete Rozelle, the young commissioner who would become the architect of the NFL's modern empire. Rozelle wasn't an owner, but he was their mouthpiece, their fixer, their salesman. And his vision was simple: package the NFL not as scattered teams fighting for survival, but as one united product. He convinced the owners to pool their television rights together, a radical concept in 1961. Instead of each team cutting its own deal, all the contracts would be sold collectively. That meant the Green Bay Packers, a tiny team in a town of barely 100,000, would earn just as much from television as the New York Giants, who played in the shadow of the Empire State Building. To the public, it looked like fairness. To the owners, it was survival wrapped in profit. The small market teams stopped worrying about extinction. The big market teams, though reluctant at first, realized they could make more money long-term by ensuring the league stayed balanced and competitive. And once the money started flowing, no one dared look back. The deal with CBS in 1962 brought in millions of fortune for the time. For the first time, owners weren't just team bosses. They were businessmen with guaranteed national revenue. That money didn't depend on whether their quarterback threw touchdowns or interceptions, whether their coach strung together a winning season. It depended on a contract that Rozelle had brokered. The NFL became, in a real sense, television property. But with every new revenue stream comes new politics. I've learned that owners rarely share without a price. Yes, they pooled television rights, but they didn't pool power equally. The men who had the commissioner's ear, the ones who shaped the agenda, used TV deals as currency. If an owner resisted Rozelle's plan, they risked being left behind in negotiations, losing influence. The league began to operate like a cartel, not in the criminal sense, but in the cold, economic one. Unity was celebrated publicly, but behind closed doors, dissent was punished. Howard Cosell, the iconic broadcaster, once said, "The NFL, more than any other sport, understood television not just as coverage, but as theater." He was right. Owners knew that to keep television happy, they needed drama, storylines, characters. And so they leaned into it. Rivalries were hyped. Players were marketed as heroes or villains. Halftime became entertainment, and Sunday afternoons became sacred. But while the fans watched touchdowns and tackles, the real plays were happening in negotiations with CBS, NBC, and eventually ABC. By the 1970s, the numbers had exploded. The 1970 merger between the NFL and the rival AFL was fueled almost entirely by broadcast leverage. Networks wanted one league, one championship, one Super Bowl, and owners obliged not out of love for the game, but out of recognition that unification meant even bigger checks. When the first Super Bowl aired, it wasn't even called the Super Bowl yet, but over 50 million people tuned in. The networks were ecstatic. The owners had found their golden goose. And yet, here's the dirty truth. Television money insulated owners from accountability. Stadium attendance dipped. No matter TV revenue kept the balance sheets in the black. A franchise struggled for years without winning. The national deal guaranteed income regardless. Owners could make poor football decisions and still profit because the real scoreboard was written in television contracts. Consider Al Davis, the Maverick owner of the Oakland Raiders. He fought bitterly with Rozelle, often clashing in courtrooms rather than locker rooms. Davis believed each owner should control his own destiny, his own TV rights. But even Davis, the league's great rebel, cashed the same television checks as everyone else. The hypocrisy was clear. No one wanted to leave money on the table, no matter how loudly they preached independence. Television also gave owners a new kind of weapon: relocation. Suddenly, threatening to move a franchise to a bigger television market carried weight. Los Angeles, with its massive TV audience, became the carrot dangled in negotiations. Owners demanded new stadiums, tax breaks, and civic concessions by leveraging the idea that they could take their product and its broadcast ratings. Where all we swass. Its broadcast ratings. Where all swass, with its massive cess, became the second of Sengatrastics. Where all swass, where all swass to where all swass, where all swass Defy way. Procade. By where I so wise. By YIR. We si carried. We so we salide. By o winely sibly. Be si tired. It's all sick it to me sick silla. It's cucus you get wood to the tie. Reese it I sit it lie. I get lit ipatit so disc the sick assist these seatent. It's good as sit about stand that it's specific. Cities weren't just fighting for football pride anymore. They were fighting for broadcast relevance. I can still hear the words of sports journalist Frank Deford, who once observed, "The NFL is the only business where failure is rewarded with more money." He wasn't exaggerating. Owners of losing teams didn't collapse financially, they often grew richer thanks to shared TV deals. The incentive to innovate, to take risks on the field, was dulled. The incentive to manipulate, to angle for bigger slices of the television pie, only grew sharper. By the 1980s, Monday Night Football had become a cultural institution. Howard Cosell, Frank Gifford, Don Meredith, they weren't just narrators, they were part of the spectacle. And behind the spectacle, owners were renegotiating contracts, playing networks off each other, maximizing leverage. Billions poured in. To the public, it was entertainment. To the owners, it was empire building. And with empire comes arrogance. Some owners began treating their teams less like sporting institutions and more like media assets. The Dallas Cowboys under Tex, Schramm, and Clint. Murchison Jr. became America's team not because of football dominance alone, but because they mastered television, imagery cheerleaders, marketing, branding. Other owners watched and followed. The game itself became just one layer of the business. Looking back, I realized television didn't just save the NFL, transformed it into something unrecognizable from its rough origins. It made the league a monopoly, a cultural behemoth, and it made owners untouchable in ways they had never been before. Players still fought for contracts, unions still battled for rights, but the owners, they were always insulated by broadcast gold. The dirty deal of television wasn't just the billions exchanged. It was the way it rewrote accountability, shifted priorities, and turned the NFL into a corporation where the product was less about the sport and more about the spectacle. And once owners tasted that, they never let go. Because at the end of the day, games are fleeting. Championships come and go. But television contracts, those became the lifeblood, the quiet, steady heartbeat of the league. And every beat was controlled not on the field, but in the back rooms, where owners smiled across tables, signed deals, and reshaped the destiny of American sports. That's where the NFL's dirty deals lived in the ink of contracts. In the shadows of boardrooms, in the manipulation of a system that guaranteed owners would always win, whether their teams did or not. I remember the first time I walked into a brand new NFL stadium. The air carried the scent of fresh paint, new concrete, polished chrome, and promise. The giant video board glowed like a city unto itself. Fireworks cut the sky, and thousands of fans roared as though they had entered a cathedral. The story told that night was one of progress, community, and civic pride. But underneath that bright spectacle, behind the speeches from mayors and owners and league officials, there was a truth far less glamorous. The stadiums that rose to the heavens were monuments, not just to football, but to financial engineering, political pressure, and deals that left taxpayers carrying the load while the NFL counted the profits. The stadium era didn't happen overnight. In the early decades of the league, football played on modest grounds, shared baseball parks, college fields, and bare-bones venues that didn't even have modern locker rooms. Back then, the NFL was still finding its identity, and stadiums weren't temples, they were simply places to play. But as television money grew, franchises transformed from community teams into billion-dollar private enterprises. Owners realized something. The real money wasn't just in the game itself. It was in the building. Stadiums could be weapons, tools of leverage against cities, and bargaining chips against rivals. The new NFL wouldn't just sell tickets, it would sell entire urban landscapes. The pivot began in the post-war years when American cities were trying desperately to project growth and relevance. Teams discovered that they could dangle their presence as a prize. Cities were told, "Build us a modern stadium or we'll move." It wasn't an idle threat. The first great shockwave came in 1984, when Robert Irsay packed up the Baltimore Colts and moved them to Indianapolis in the dead of night. For Baltimore, it was a civic tragedy. For other cities, it was a warning. Lose your team, and you lose your soul. Politicians learned that lesson quickly, and owners used it ruthlessly. By the 1990s, the stadium arms race was in full swing. Owners knew they could pit cities against one another, demanding luxury boxes, naming rights, and publicly funded upgrades. The most infamous cases became symbols of civic surrender. Take St. Louis, where the city offered the Rams a sweetheart deal to lure them away from Los Angeles. A new domed stadium, millions in subsidies, and the promise of growth. For a time, it worked. The Rams won a Super Bowl in 2000, and St. Louis believed the investment had paid off. But just over a decade later, the team bolted back to Los Angeles, leaving St. Louis with hundreds of millions in debt and an empty building. The NFL had already cashed the checks. It wasn't just St. Louis. Across the country, from Cincinnati to Minneapolis, from Las Vegas to Atlanta, cities signed deals that tilted heavily in favor of the league. Owners framed it as partnership, but the numbers told a darker story. A 2015 report by the Brookings Institution revealed that, since 2000, American taxpayers had poured more than $7 billion into NFL stadium construction. $7 billion money pulled from public budgets that could have funded schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Instead, it subsidized billionaire owners and franchises already flush with TV revenue. And yet, whenever a new stadium opened, the message was the same. This was for the people. Stadiums would create jobs, stimulate the economy, put the city on the national map. But independent studies repeatedly showed otherwise. The jobs were temporary. The economic impact marginal at best. The long-term benefits elusive. Andrew Zimbalist, a sports economist, once told Congress the net economic impact of professional sports franchises and facilities is close to zero. The reality was clear. Stadiums weren't about civic prosperity. They were about private enrichment. Still, the spectacle worked. When Jerry Jones unveiled AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas in 2009, it wasn't just a football venue. It was a statement. The NFL could build palaces larger, grander, and more expensive than anything the world had seen. Jones secured over $300 million in public funding, even as the price tag soared past $1 billion. The building became known as Jerry World, complete with an art gallery, luxury suites that sold for millions, and a giant screen that seemed almost bigger than the field itself. Fans flocked, politicians smiled, and the Cowboys became even richer. But for residents of Arlington, the cost was real families displaced from their homes to make way for construction, taxes redirected, and a city tied to debt for decades. Every new stadium followed a familiar script. Owners threatened to move. Politicians panicked. Deals were struck in back rooms, often with little public input. And then came the groundbreaking ceremonies, the ribbon cuttings, the parades of hard hats and shovels. By the time fans filled the seats, the financial damage was already done. Las Vegas provides one of the most glaring examples. When the Raiders sought a new home, they played cities against each other with surgical precision. Oakland wouldn't pay. San Diego couldn't. But Las Vegas offered nearly $750 million in public money to bring the franchise to the desert. The result was Allegiant Stadium, a $1.9 billion colossus rising from the Strip. The Raiders gained a sparkling new identity. The NFL expanded its footprint. And taxpayers took on nearly $1 billion in debt that would linger long after the last snap. I think often about the people left behind in these stories. The teachers who worked in underfunded classrooms while their city funneled millions into luxury suites. the homeowners displaced in Arlington. The small businesses promised an economic boom, only to discover that game day dollars never really trickled into their neighborhoods. These voices rarely made it into the highlight reels. The stadiums shone like monuments to progress, but the sacrifices were buried in shadows. And yet, the NFL thrived on these optics. A new stadium wasn't just a building, it was leverage for television deals, justification for ticket price hikes, and a lure for corporate sponsors. Every gleaming luxury box, every multi-million-dollar naming rights contract, every massive video board fed the league's machine. The fans cheered, but the game had changed. The business of football had become bigger than football itself. What strikes me most, looking back, is how normalized it all became. Cities that resisted were called short-sighted. Politicians who pushed back were accused of failing their constituents. Fans, desperate to keep their teams, often sided with the billionaires, fearing that without subsidies, the franchise would flee. It was emotional blackmail on a civic scale, and it worked again and again. And so, as the NFL entered the 21st century, the stadiums stood as towering symbols of both triumph and betrayal. They were cathedrals where dreams were played out on Sunday afternoons, but also reminders of a system that turned public trust into private gain. To understand the league's power, you only had to look at the skyline of a city, where the largest, most expensive building was often a football stadium. Not a hospital, not a school, not a library, a stadium. And that is the paradox at the heart of the NFL's stadium era. A league that sold itself as the beating heart of America, while quietly perfecting the art of taking from the very communities it claimed to serve. The stadiums still glitter today, monuments to the NFL's ambition. But behind the lights, behind the roars, the deals that built them tell the story of how football became more than a sport. It became a business that rewrote the rules of civic life, leaving us to ask, when the game ends, who really wins? I've often thought about how the NFL became more than a sport, how it turned into a ritual, almost a religion, played out on living room televisions across America. And the answer, when you strip away the myths, is television itself. Broadcast money didn't just fund the league, it rewired its very DNA. It turned Sunday afternoons into a shared national theater. And it gave owners the kind of leverage they had only dreamed about in the early days. The shift began in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when Pete Rozelle became commissioner. Rozelle had been a public relations man, not a football lifer. He understood image, spectacle, and the power of television better than any executive before him. When he took over in 1960, the NFL wasn't yet America's game. Baseball still ruled the headlines, boxing had bigger names, and college football had deeper traditions. But Rozelle saw what they didn't. The future would be mediated through a screen. In 1961, he engineered the breakthrough that would change everything. The league signed a television contract with CBS, not as individual teams, but as a collective. For the first time, every team agreed to pool its TV rights and share revenue equally. It was a radical move, and the courts had to approve it through the Sports Broadcasting Act. But when it passed, the NFL had discovered the goose that would keep laying golden eggs. Owners who had been scraping by suddenly had guaranteed revenue no matter their market size. A small-town team like Green Bay could now stand financially alongside franchises in New York or Chicago. Howard Cosell, the gravel-voiced broadcaster who became synonymous with football in the 1970s, once said, "What Rozelle did was brilliant. He created the most perfect marriage between sports and television America had ever seen." And Cosell wasn't exaggerating. Television didn't just show the game. It transformed it. Camera angles highlighted collisions. Slow motion captured the violence with a kind of artistic reverence, and halftime shows built drama like acts in a play. By the late 60s, the NFL was no longer chasing baseball, it was overtaking it. The 1958 NFL Championship, often called the greatest game ever played, had introduced many Americans to pro football on TV, but it was the steady drip of weekly broadcasts that cemented the addiction. Sundays became appointment viewing, a time when families gathered not around a dining table, but around a glowing screen. Then came the masterstroke. Monday Night Football in 1970. Rozelle and a B.C. Executive Roone Arledge knew primetime television was untapped territory. They took football, wrapped it in show business, and dropped it into the middle of the week. The gamble worked beyond anyone's imagination. With Howard Cosell, Dandy Dunn Meredith, and Frank Gifford in the booth, Monday Night Football wasn't just a game, it was entertainment. It blended sport with theater, gossip, even comedy. The ratings were massive. Suddenly, football wasn't confined to die-hard fans, it was pop culture. I sometimes think about the effect of those broadcasts on the players themselves. They were no longer just athletes, they were performers in America's most watched show. Every hit, every touchdown, every mistake, now replayed in slow motion before millions. The fame grew, but the money didn't keep pace, at least not for the men on the field. Owners were raking in unprecedented profits from TV contracts, but most players were still working in the off-season, selling insurance or cars just to stay afloat. The spectacle grew richer, but the labor behind it remained expendable. The NFL's deal with the networks was a masterclass in business. They created scarcity. They made Sunday afternoon feel sacred by offering just a few games at fixed times. They dictated what the nation would see, who would become heroes, and who would remain invisible. If a player was featured on a national broadcast, his name could be etched into history. If not, he might toil in obscurity, no matter his talent. It was power hidden in plain sight, the ability to shape narratives by deciding who got the spotlight. And television also reshaped the rules of the game itself. Officials were encouraged to keep the action flowing for broadcast windows. Commercial breaks dictated stoppages. Instant replay was introduced to satisfy television audiences, not the players. Even the pace of halftime was adjusted to fit into network schedules. Football was no longer just a contest between two teams, it was a product tailored for maximum ratings. I remember reading a remark from former player Alex Karras, who later became an actor himself. He once said, "We weren't playing for wins and losses anymore. We were playing for television." It sounds dramatic, but in many ways, he was right. The league's rise was inseparable from the television era. The players' sweat and sacrifice were the raw material, but it was the broadcast gloss that turned it into gold. By the 1980s, television money was so entrenched that the NFL had become untouchable. Super Bowls were cultural landmarks. Halftime shows rivaled the games themselves. And advertisers were paying millions for 30-second spots. Owners had discovered the ultimate machine, a sport that sold itself not only as competition, but as America's weekly drama. Yet behind that success was a widening chasm. Players saw the billions flowing in, but felt the ground beneath them had T-shifted nearly as much. Strikes in 1982 and 1987 were born out of that frustration. Men risked their careers demanding a bigger share of the pie, but owners held the trump card: the TV contracts. Even during strikes, networks kept paying, ensuring owners stayed afloat while players lost paychecks. It was an imbalance baked into the very system Rozelle had created decades earlier. Television had turned the NFL into America's most lucrative sport, but it also cemented owners as the gatekeepers of that wealth. They had built a fortress of revenue sharing and guaranteed contracts with networks, insulating themselves from market swings and labor unrest. The players remained the gladiators, but the arena on the broadcast rights to it belonged to the men upstairs. As I reflect on it now, it's striking how invisible those deals were to the average fan. People tuned in for touchdowns and rivalries, not realizing that every commercial break, every primetime matchup was part of a grander strategy. The NFL wasn't just a league, was a broadcast empire. Sundays weren't just about football, they were about control, spectacle, and the quiet dominance of owners who had learned how to profit without ever stepping onto the field. The rise of television money was more than just a business success, it was a turning point in American culture. It made football the national pastime. It made billionaires out of men who once ran small-town franchises. And it built a system where players became household names, but rarely reaped the rewards their fame suggested. As Howard Cosell once warned, almost prophetically, the danger is when the games become more about the show than the sport itself. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened. The NFL had become America's #1 show, but behind the curtain, the script was being written by owners, advertisers, and networks, while the players played their parts until their bodies gave out. Television was the league's rocket fuel, but it was also the moment when the balance of power tipped decisively. Owners didn't just survive anymore, they thrived, protected by the endless stream of network dollars. Players, meanwhile, would have to fight harder than ever to claim their share of a pie that seemed to grow larger with every broadcast contract. And that fight is where the story turns next. Because the television empire built in the 1960s and 70s set the stage for the labor battles of the 1980s and 1990s battles that would reshape the relationship between owners and players forever. I remember the first time I heard the phrase salary cap. It sounded sterile, almost harmless, like some administrative tool meant to keep the books tidy. But in reality, it was a chess piece moved with precision, designed not just to organize numbers, but to tilt the balance of power. It was the kind of quiet revolution only the owners could pull off, cloaked in language about parity and fairness, while hiding its true function: control. To understand how we arrived at the cap, you have to rewind to the free agency battles of the 1970s and 80s. For decades, the reserve clause had chained players to the teams that drafted them, stripping them of leverage. When antitrust lawsuits cracked that foundation, when stars like Reggie White fought and won the right to choose their destiny, it felt like the tide had turned. The players had claimed freedom, and in theory, they had leverage. But the owners, burned by those legal defeats, weren't about to sit idly by. They were businessmen, and businessmen never stopped searching for the angle. The angle came in the early 1990s, forged in smoke-filled rooms where billionaires and union leaders locked horns. At the center was the NFL's television contract, by then the richest in all of sports. The money was so astronomical, so dependable, that it became both carrot and stick. The owners promised the players a slice, guaranteed revenues that could finally bring stability to a union often fractured by strikes and mistrust. But the catch was non-negotiable: a salary cap. On paper, the cap looked democratic. Every team would operate within the same payroll limits, ensuring that no single franchise could simply outspend the rest. The league packaged it as a recipe for competitive balance. Fans want to know their team has a chance, one owner said at the time. It was the kind of line that played well in the media, selling the image of a league where the smallest market could topple the biggest. And yes, parity did follow. In the decades after the cap's introduction in 1994, the NFL became the most unpredictable league in American sports, a place where dynasties were rare and Cinderella stories became yearly tradition. But beneath the surface, the cap was more than a balancing act, it was a leash. It gave owners a way to cap not just team payrolls, but player ambition. Free agency had created the illusion of choice. The cap ensured that choice would always be contained. The message to players was simple: you can move, but only within the boundaries we draw. I think of Reggie White again, the man often called the father of modern free agency. His lawsuit against the league cracked open the door for player mobility. And yet, almost as soon as he walked through it, the walls closed back in. The cap meant that even a superstar like White was subject to market ceilings. Teams didn't just decide whether they wanted him. They decided whether they could afford him under the league's artificial math. The irony was cruel freedom, but not quite. The other thing the salary cap did was shift the burden of sacrifice. When owners overspent or mismanaged contracts, they could point to the cap and claim their hands were tied. When a beloved veteran was cut in the name of cap space, fans rarely blamed the billionaire upstairs. They blamed the player's age or his salary demand. The cap created a shield of plausible deniability, insulating owners from the fallout of cold business decisions. And yet, as much as players distrusted it, the cap wasn't all poison. The revenue-sharing system that accompanied it guaranteed them a fixed percentage of the NFL's ever-growing pie. For the first time, the union could look at the books and know that billions flowing in from television would flow back out into salaries. In many ways, the cap era created the millionaire middle class of the NFL, ensuring that it wasn't just quarterbacks and superstars cashing in, but linemen, safeties, and role players too. Still, the trade-off was stark. The owners had framed the terms of freedom. They had converted a legal defeat, the loss of absolute control under the reserve clause, into a practical victory. They could still dictate the boundaries of the labor market. They could still ensure that no matter how high the revenue soared, the player's share would remain contained by the cap's ceiling. What fascinates me most is how the cap reshaped not just economics, but psychology. Players began talking about themselves not just as athletes, but as cap hits, numbers on a spreadsheet. Broadcasters casually spoke of dead money and cap casualties, as if the language of accounting was inseparable from the language of the game. It was a subtle but powerful shift proof that the owner's framing had worked. They had turned players into assets, evaluated less by what they did on Sundays and more by how they fit into the balance sheet. There were players who railed against it. Gene Upshaw, the longtime head of the NFL Players Association, warned that the cap was a Trojan horse. He knew it gave owners leverage in every negotiation. "They'll sell it as a win," he said privately, "but will live with the consequences for decades." He was right. Every time a team cut a franchise icon for cap reasons, every time a young star was told there was no room left under the ceiling, the owner's plan revealed itself. And then there were the lockouts. Twice in 1993 and again in 2011, the cap became the flashpoint for work stoppages. Both times, owners dug in, leveraging the players' short career spans against them. They knew that every week without a paycheck hit the athletes harder than it hit billionaires with diversified portfolios. And both times, the players eventually bent, agreeing to terms that left the cap structure intact. What strikes me, looking back, is how much the cap aligned with the NFL's broader mythology. This was the league that marketed itself as America's game, a meritocracy where hard work and strategy mattered more than wealth or geography. The cap fit perfectly into that narrative, giving fans the sense that their underdog team really could climb the mountain. But it was also a myth of control. The league's great selling point that anyone could win was less about pure competition than about carefully calibrated balance. Engineered in boardrooms by the same men who preached about the integrity of the game. By the time the cap era was fully entrenched, the NFL had become a financial juggernaut unlike anything the world had seen. The league's revenues grew from billions to tens of billions, and yet the percentage going to players remained tightly bounded. Owners had found their sweet spot, a system that looked fair, felt competitive, and guaranteed them profits that rivaled entire industries. When I think about the salary cap, I don't just think about numbers or contracts. I think about the quiet genius of its design. It was never just about leveling the playing field. It was about preserving the hierarchy. It was about making sure that no matter how much money poured in, the men in suits upstairs would always remain the architects of the system, while the men in helmets remained its labor. That's the paradox of the salary cap. It gave the NFL the unpredictability that fans crave, but it did so by fixing the rules in ways most never saw. It gave players guaranteed slices of revenue, but only within boundaries that protected the owner's dominance. It made the league stronger, richer, and more compelling, but it did so by ensuring that the balance of power never truly shifted. And in the end, that's what dirty deals are all about. They aren't the backroom betrayals you see in movies. They're quieter, subtler, cloaked in the language of fairness and progress. They're agreements that look like compromise, but tilt the future toward one side. The salary cap wasn't just a financial tool, it was a statement. A line drawn in history by the owners to remind everyone that even in a league built on collisions, the real battles are fought off the field. They told us the game belonged to the people. That Sunday afternoons were sacred because they brought communities together. That stadiums were cathedrals, built for fans, symbols of pride. Places where fathers and mothers could hand down a tradition to their children. But behind the banners, the fight songs, and the fireworks, another story was being written, a story where stadiums weren't temples of sports at all. They were financial instruments, bargaining chips, weapons wielded by owners to extract billions from the very fans who filled the seats. After the salary cap settled into place in the 1990s, owners realized something profound. The game itself was profitable. Yes, but the infrastructure of the stadiums forwarded a deeper, longer-lasting pipeline of wealth. Unlike the players, stadiums never asked for new contracts. They never tore a CLS. They never aged out of their prime. They just kept generating revenue, year after year, as long as the right deal was struck. And those deals, more often than not, leaned on taxpayers to foot the bill. I think back to the words of sports economist Roger Knoll, who once said bluntly, "A stadium is a money-losing proposition for the city, but a money-making proposition for the team." That contradiction became the very essence of the NFL's new business model. The playbook was simple. Owners would threaten to move their team unless a city agreed to build or renovate a stadium with public funds. Sometimes it was relocation to Los Angeles, the league's perpetual boogeyman market that sat without a team for over 2 decades, always lurking as a threat. Other times, it was a quieter menace. Whispers of greener pastures in another state, another city willing to pony up the cash, and cities desperate to keep their teams often caved. Take Cleveland in the mid-1990s. Art Modell, owner of the Browns, had long complained about Cleveland Stadium, calling it outdated and financially draining. When the city hesitated to meet his demands for upgrades, he struck a deal with Baltimore City, desperate to bring football back after losing the Colts in 1984. The result? A Browns packed up in 1996, and overnight, Cleveland lost one of its oldest, most beloved franchises. The pain was so raw that fans wept in the streets, holding signs that read, "Don't take our Browns." The NFL, in a rare act of contrition, promised Cleveland an expansion team 3 years later. But by then, the message was clear. Loyalty wasn't to fans or history. It was to leverage. Baltimore got a new stadium largely funded by Maryland taxpayers, over $200 million worth. Modell walked into a better financial future, while Cleveland citizens were left scrambling to finance their own replacement stadium to lure the expansion Browns. Both cities ended up paying. The owner never lost, and it didn't stop there. Across the country, the late 1990s and early 2000s became an arms race of stadium construction. Dallas, Houston, Detroit, Nashville, Cincinnati, and countless others either built new facilities or heavily renovated old ones. The numbers were staggering. From 1997 to 2007 alone, taxpayers shelled out over $7 billion for NFL stadiums. $7 billion, an amount that dwarfed most city budgets for schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. But the deals weren't sold as financial burdens. They were packaged as investments. Owners promised jobs, tourism, revitalized downtowns. They held press conferences where city leaders cut ribbons and beamed about civic pride. Yet, study after study revealed the truth. The economic impact of stadiums was wildly overstated. Most of the money spent inside a stadium didn't create new economic activity, simply diverted local spending from one form of entertainment to another. Families who bought tickets weren't creating new dollars in the economy. They were shifting dollars away from restaurants, movie theaters, and small businesses. The late economist Andrew Zimbalist once called it a zero-sum game. And yet, time and time again, cities lined up to play it. Why? Because no mayor or governor wanted to be the one who lost the team. The political fallout was too great, and owners knew it. They played cities against each other like pawns on a chessboard, extracting maximum concessions every step of the way. One of the most infamous examples came with the construction of a TNT stadium in Arlington, Texas. Jerry Jones, ever the showman, envisioned the most extravagant football palace the world had ever seen. With a retractable roof, a massive high-definition video board, and luxury boxes fit for billionaires, the cost ballooned to over $1.2 billion. And who paid for it? Taxpayers in Arlington shouldered roughly $325 million through sales and hotel taxes. Jones himself contributed heavily too, but the precedent remained. Ordinary citizens were subsidizing a billionaire's dream project, often without a real say. When voters opposed deals, owners found ways around them. In St. Louis, taxpayers grew weary of paying off debt from the Edward Jones Dome, built in 1995. By 2016, the Dome was still owed $144 million in bonds, even as the Rams owner Stan Kroenke maneuvered the team back to Los Angeles. St. Louis lost its team, but was left with decades of debt. Kroenke, meanwhile, funded his new Inglewood Stadium with private money, but only because the LA market itself was lucrative enough to ensure billions in returns. Even then, he negotiated tax breaks and infrastructure support to ease his burden. It became the ultimate irony. Stadiums were sold as symbols of civic pride, but they left cities financially weakened, saddled with debt that outlasted the very players fans came to see. The average NFL career is just over 3 years. The average stadium bond? 30. Generations of citizens paid for monuments they didn't choose. Also, owners could secure luxury suites and naming rights deals worth hundreds of millions. And through it all, the league maintained its carefully crafted narrative that football was America's game, rooted in tradition, community, and shared identity. Few dared to question the darker truth that the same communities who built the game with their loyalty were being asked to subsidize it with their taxes. I remember reading a line from journalist Greg Easterbrook, who put it bluntly in The Atlantic: "The National Football League is socialism for the rich." Owners shared costs when it suited them, like revenue sharing, but privatized profits whenever possible. Stadium financing was just the next logical step. They had already capped the players. Now they capped the taxpayers too. The fans, of course, rarely walked away. Even when stadium deals meant higher ticket prices, even when personal seat licenses, those controversial PSLs, forced fans to pay thousands just for the right to buy season tickets. The demand didn't waver. Football had burrowed too deeply into American culture. Owners knew it. Cities knew it. And so the game of leverage continued, one deal at a time. Looking back, I see the shift as a kind of second great turning point for the NFL's financial empire. The first was the salary cap, which curbed costs and guaranteed competitive balance. The second was the stadium era, where the true winners were in T, the fans celebrating in new luxury seating, but the owners counting revenue streams. Naming rights, concessions, luxury boxes, parking fees. It wasn't T about the roar of the crowd anymore. It was about how much that roar could be monetized. And so the NFL evolved again, wielding public money as a private weapon. Stadiums rose across skylines, gleaming monuments to football and finance alike. But the cost wasn't just measured in dollars. It was measured in broken promises, strained budgets, and a public trust eroded by the realization that the game wasn't. T simply played on the field, was played in the back rooms of city halls, where billionaires always seemed to leave with the upper hand. The owners had discovered a new frontier, and with it, they solidified their grip on America's most powerful sport. When the dust settled from the era of salary caps and free agency, the battlefield of NFL power shifted. Owners had learned how to control labor costs and had grown, confident in their ability to manipulate contracts and player leverage. But there was another, even more lucrative front waiting to be exploited, a realm where civic pride and political maneuvering collided with billion-dollar interests. Stadiums, glass and steel cathedrals rising out of tax dollars, wrapped in the banners of local identity, yet controlled by a handful of owners who treated them not as public spaces, but as private leverage. I remember the first time I started piecing it all together. The pattern was undeniable. Whenever a franchise grew restless, the script repeated itself like clockwork. An owner would begin floating rumors of relocation, subtle at first, then bolder. Politicians would panic, desperate not to be remembered as the leaders who lost the team. Consultants and lobbyists would be hired, charts and promises drafted, and soon the conversation turned into a kind of civic ransom. Pay for the stadium or lose the franchise. It was a modern form of extortion, dressed up as economic development. The NFL perfected this game in the late 20th century. Cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Houston became case studies in how the league used relocation as a cudgel. Art Modell's move of the Browns to Baltimore in 1996 stands as one of the most infamous examples. To the outside world, it was shocking. The Browns were one of the league's most storied franchises, deeply woven into Cleveland's identity. But Modell had grown tired of the old Cleveland Stadium and frustrated by a city unwilling or unable to hand him the state-of-the-art facility he demanded. Baltimore, still stinging from the loss of the Colts years earlier, offered what Cleveland would not: hundreds of millions in public financing. And just like that, generations of loyalty were discarded for a deal struck behind closed doors. When Modell was pressed about it later, his response was chillingly simple: "I had no choice. The economics dictated it." But the truth was never about survival, was about leverage. Cleveland proved that if a city flinched, another would step in, checkbook open. The NFL owners had discovered a weapon more powerful than any contract clause or free agency restriction. Stadium deals became the new frontier of profit, and public funds became their favorite currency. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a model was perfected. Demand massive public subsidies for construction. Secure sweetheart leases that allowed teams to keep nearly all stadium revenue and walk away with an asset that appreciated in value overnight. Consider the case of St. Louis. In 1995, the city bent over backward to lure the Rams from Los Angeles, offering a publicly financed domed stadium with provisions so favorable that taxpayers would later regret them for decades. At the time, it was pitched as a civic investment: jobs, tourism, economic growth. The promises were grand. But studies years later revealed what economists had warned from the start: stadiums rarely generate the broad-based economic boom advertised. Instead, they siphon taxpayer dollars to benefit a small group of wealthy owners. And when the stadium in St. Louis began to age and fell below the league's top-tier standard, the Rams owner, Stan Kroenke, used that very clause to justify bolting back to Los Angeles in 2016. Billions in taxpayer investment discarded as leverage. This cycle became the defining playbook of NFL ownership. The Raiders held Oakland hostage repeatedly, flirting with Los Angeles before finally moving to Las Vegas, where the state of Nevada committed an unprecedented $750 million in public funds toward Allegiant Stadium. The Buffalo Bills, one of the league's small market darlings, extracted over $800 million in public financing for a new stadium deal in 2022. Despite ownership belonging to one of the wealthiest families in America, and time after time, fans were told the same story: if you want your team to stay, you pay. It's a striking contradiction. The NFL is the most profitable sports league in the world, generating revenues exceeding $18 billion annually. Its franchises routinely sell for billions of dollars, with owners ranking among the wealthiest individuals in America. Yet these same owners consistently shift the burden of stadium construction onto working-class taxpayers, many of whom will never step foot in luxury boxes or club-level seats. Critics like economist Roger Knoll have been blunt. Stadium subsidies are a classic case of corporate welfare. And yet, they persist. Why? Because the league has mastered the art of civic manipulation. Teams are woven into the fabric of community identity. To lose one is to lose more than just a sports franchise. It's a blow to pride, to memory, to belonging. Owners know this. They exploit it. They force mayors and governors into impossible positions where the political fallout of losing a team outweighs the fiscal responsibility of saying no. What makes it even more insidious is how owners cloak their demands in the language of partnership. They frame it as an investment in the future, as if the stadium itself were a public good, like a library or a hospital. They bring renderings of gleaming facilities, promising jobs, tourism, and visibility on a global stage. But the fine print tells the real story. Revenue streams, naming rights, concessions, parking. Luxury suites almost always flow directly to ownership, not the public. And when the building begins to age, the cycle starts again, with demands for upgrades or replacements, often long before the original debt has even been paid off. The story of these deals isn't just about money, it's about control. By tying cities to massive long-term debt obligations, owners ensure that franchises remain politically untouchable. No mayor wants to be the one left paying off bonds on a stadium without a team inside it. No governor wants to risk the backlash of losing Sunday football. In this way, stadium financing became a weapon more enduring than the salary cap. It guaranteed owners not just profits, but power. I think of how Jerry Jones leveraged public funding for a TNT stadium in Arlington. Texas saw $1.2 billion palace, with taxpayer money covering over $300 million of the cost. Jones turned it into one of the most lucrative venues in sports, a monument to both ambition and audacity. When critics balked, Jones framed it as a partnership with the community. Yet today, AT&T Stadium generates millions in revenue streams far beyond football, from concerts to college games, all flowing back into the Cowboys' empire. What's perhaps most striking is how normalized this has become. Fans rally to support tax hikes, bond issues, and subsidies under the belief that keeping the team is worth any cost. Politicians boast about securing stadium deals as if they are legacies of progress, even as libraries close and infrastructure crumbles. The narrative has been so carefully managed that resistance feels almost un-American. As though questioning the wisdom of public subsidies for billionaires equates to disloyalty to the team. The human cost often gets buried beneath the spectacle. In cities like Oakland, small businesses suffered when the Raiders left, their Sunday crowds evaporating overnight. In St. Louis, taxpayers are still paying down the debt on a stadium that no longer hosts an NFL team. In Buffalo, residents face higher tax burdens to fund a facility they already supported decades earlier. And yet, the league continues to celebrate its stadiums as monuments to progress, proof of football's place at the heart of American culture. The Stadium Wars revealed something deeper about the NFL's evolution. Once the league's battles were fought between owners and players, with salary caps and contracts as the weapons. But in the 21st century, the owners shifted their gaze outward, realizing that the true prize was not just controlling labor, was controlling cities themselves. Taxpayer money became their silent partner, the foundation upon which billion-dollar empires were built. And so, the NFL grew not just as a sport, but as a political force. Each new stadium deal reinforced the hierarchy of power, reminding fans, players, and politicians alike that the game was always bigger than football. It was about leverage, about extracting maximum value from civic pride, and about bending the public will to serve private wealth. As I reflect on this, I realize the NFL story isn't just about what happens on the field. It's about what happens in boardrooms and backrooms, in city halls and state legislatures where deals are struck and futures are mortgaged. It's about how owners turn stadiums into weapons, wielding them not just against players or rivals, but against the very communities that gave them loyalty. Because behind every new gleaming stadium lies a hidden truth. The people who paid for it will rarely own a piece of it. They'll sit in the stands, wave their flags, and cheer for their team. But the real victories belong to the owners who learned long ago that in the game of leverage, nothing pays like loyalty and nothing costs like losing it. I sometimes think the NFL was never really about the field. The field was spectacle, yes, but behind it, hidden in contracts, in broadcast meetings, in corporate boardrooms, there existed another game one where the players were not athletes, but assets. By the time the new millennium arrived, the league had perfected this dual existence. Sundays belonged to the players, but Monday through Saturday belonged to the owners. And in those days, the stakes were even higher. The television era had transformed the NFL from a sport into America's most reliable form of entertainment. Billions of dollars flowed in. Networks fought over broadcast rights. Advertisers lined up to attach their brands to the shield. Yet, somehow, even as revenue soared, the men who generated those revenues, the players, were systematically boxed into smaller and smaller slices of the pie. The salary cap had already ensured that spending on talent would remain artificially constrained. Stadium subsidies had ensured that owners rarely risked their own wealth when expanding their empires. But Batch 9 takes us into the next great twist: how the NFL reshaped itself into a cash machine so efficient, so insulated, that even billionaires began to look small in comparison to the shield itself. This was the era of league-controlled image. NFL films packaged the game as mythology. The Super Bowl was marketed as not just an event, but a civic ritual. Every piece of it was carefully branded and sold. And beneath that gloss, owners realized that their greatest advantage wasn't just money, it was the ability to manipulate structure. Collective bargaining became the battlefield, and players were often ill-prepared for the complexity of what they were up against. In 2011, the NFL locked out its players. It was a showdown that revealed everything. Owners claimed the system was broken, that costs were unsustainable, that the very survival of the league was at stake. But documents later showed that profitability was soaring. "It's the greatest business in the world," Cowboys owner Jerry Jones said in a rare, candid moment. "We can't lose. The TV networks are paying us to guarantee content, and we control the product." The lockout wasn't about saving the league. It was about reminding the players who held the real power. I remember speaking with a veteran lineman around that time, and he told me, "You train your whole life to be here. And then you find out you're playing two different games, one on the field, one off it. And the one off it you've already lost before you've even stepped in." The 2011 standoff ended, as most of them do, with compromise that tilted toward ownership. Players fought for better health benefits and minor concessions on revenue sharing. Owners secured a longer season, stricter salary cap controls, and a rookie wage scale that devalued incoming talent before they'd even played it down. It was brilliant in its cruelty. By capping rookie contracts, owners ensured that their most marketable young stars, the lifeblood of the league, were cheap labor for years. That one shift alone saved franchises hundreds of millions over the next decade. The irony, of course, was that this was sold as protecting the game. But protecting the game really meant protecting margins. Players became interchangeable units in a system designed to minimize risk. When one body broke down, another stood ready. When one contract became too expensive, a rookie could replace him at a fraction of the cost. And all the while, owners insulated themselves with guaranteed revenue streams that no performance on the field could threaten. You could see the consequences everywhere. Stars retired earlier, broken bodies piling up in their 30s. Journeymen cycled through practice squads, barely hanging on. The average NFL career remained shockingly short, barely 3 years. And yet, the average franchise valuation doubled, then tripled. By 2020, some teams were worth over $4 billion. This is where the true paradox of the NFL revealed itself. The league was marketed as a meritocracy. Work harder, play better, earn your glory. But in reality, the system off the field rewarded stagnation and guaranteed returns. Washington's Daniel Snyder presided over 2 decades of chaos, scandal, and losing records. But when he finally sold the team, he walked away with more than $6 billion. That was his consolation prize for failure. Compare that to the lineman who leaves the game with 2 blown knees, no pension, and mounting medical bills. In a system so carefully designed, failure for the few at the top was still victory, while for the many at the bottom, even victory could feel like loss. There's a haunting truth here. The NFL's rise was never accidental. It was engineered. Salary caps, rookie wage scales, taxpayer-funded stadiums, guaranteed broadcast deals, all of it formed a structure where risk was almost entirely absorbed by players, fans, and communities, while reward flowed upward. And every decade, the structures became more sophisticated, more entrenched, until the idea of fairness seemed almost laughable. Yet, even with all this, the myth of the game persisted. Because on Sundays, the stadiums filled. Televisions glowed in living rooms across America, and for 3 hours at a time, none of that other reality mattered. The NFL understood that distraction better than anyone. The violence, the sacrifice, the gloriette was enough to keep the machine turning. But underneath, in quieter moments, cracks began to show. Former players sued the league over concussions, exposing decades of suppressed science and denial. Communities questioned why they were footing the bill for billionaire owners' stadiums. Younger athletes began to weigh whether the dream was worth the toll. And slowly, a narrative emerged, not about the beauty of the game, but about the cost of it. I think often about a quote from Troy Vincent, a former Pro Bowl defensive back who later became an NFL executive. He said, "This league will use you until you can't give any more, and then it moves on." That's the truth. The question is, what do you do with that truth? Batch 9 is about staring directly into that truth, about recognizing that while the NFL presented itself as a national treasure, its architecture was built on imbalance. Owners with safety nets, players without them. Communities that invested billions only to watch teams relocate when it suited corporate interests. A sport that celebrated resilience and toughness, but operated with cold calculation off the field. By the end of this era, it became clear. The NFL had won not just the game of football, but the game of business. It had created a model where loyalty, sacrifice, and physical cost were demanded from players and fans alike, while reward flowed upward with ruthless efficiency. The machine was perfect. Almost too perfect. And like all machines, it left behind those it no longer needed. This isn't cynicism, it's history. The NFL became America's most successful league, not simply because of touchdowns or dynasties, but because of structures designed to guarantee profit. And as we step into the next batch, we'll see how those structures shaped not just the league, but the very lives of those who passed through it. Because for all the glory of Sunday, Monday always came and on Monday. The reality was ownership's game. I remember when the first concussion lawsuit made headlines. It was a moment that cut through the noise of touchdowns and highlight reels. A reminder that football's most painful secrets were no longer confined to locker rooms and late-night whispers. This wasn't just about a single player or even a few dozen. It was about thousands of men who had dedicated their lives to the sport, only to find out that the very league they served had been keeping critical truths hidden from them. The concussion lawsuits didn't emerge overnight. They were born out of decades of denial, silence, and a carefully constructed shield by NFL owners who understood something long before the public did. That repeated head trauma could permanently alter the human brain. Yet acknowledging that truth outright would mean unraveling the golden fabric of football itself. And so, owners, with the help of league-appointed doctors, did what powerful institutions often do when their empire is threatened. They buried the evidence, bought silence where they could, and created their own narrative to protect the shield. The lawsuit filed in 2011 was monumental in size. More than 4,500 former players joined, and thousands more would follow. They accused the NFL of negligence, of deliberately concealing the risks of concussions while profiting off the very collisions that created them. One of the most haunting lines from the plaintiff's filing still resonates. The NFL was aware of the evidence and risks associated with repetitive traumatic brain injuries, but deliberately ignored and actively concealed. That information that wasn't just a legal statement was a betrayal put into words. Behind the legal motions and depositions were men whose stories spoke louder than any courtroom argument. Mike Webster, the legendary center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, became the symbol of what football could do to the human mind. After years of punishing blows, Webster's health deteriorated in ways that seemed almost unbelievable. He suffered from memory loss, dementia, depression, and eventually found himself living out of his car, estranged from the game he once defined. When he died in 2002, an autopsy revealed the first clear evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE) in a professional football player. The discovery was groundbreaking, but for the NFL, it was terrifying. Instead of immediately addressing the danger, the league assembled what it called the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee. On the surface, it sounded responsible, even proactive. But in reality, the committee was more about managing perception than protecting players. Chaired by Dr. Elliot Pellman, a rheumatologist with no background in neurology, the committee consistently downplayed the risks of concussions, publishing papers that suggested players could safely return to the field after suffering head injuries. It was a scientific smokescreen, designed not to inform, but to obscure. Players at the time trusted the league's authority. When a team doctor said, "You're fine, you can go back in," most didn't question it. They believed in the machine because questioning it meant questioning the very foundation of their careers. But over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Men in their 40s and 50s were experiencing symptoms typically associated with advanced age: cognitive decline, uncontrollable mood swings, and, in too many cases, suicide. Junior Seau, Dave Durson, Andre Waters, names that should have been remembered for glory instead became reminders of the price the game extracted. When the lawsuits finally coalesced into one of the largest class action cases in sports history, the NFL's defense was telling. They denied the accusations outright, claiming they had always placed player safety as a top priority. But documents began surfacing: internal memos, correspondence, scientific studies that painted a different story. The NFL wasn't just negligent. It had actively shaped research to fit its narrative, funding studies that contradicted independent findings and discrediting doctors who raised alarms. One of those doctors was Dr. Bennett Omalu, the neuropathologist who discovered CTE in Mike Webster's brain. His research was met not with gratitude from the NFL, but with hostility. League representatives dismissed his findings as flawed, labeling him an outsider who didn't understand the sport. But Omalu persisted, and eventually his work gained traction, leading to widespread recognition of CTE as a disease tied directly to football. Still, the years of denial had cost countless lives. The eventual settlement between the NFL and former players was historic, reaching nearly $1 billion. On the surface, it looked like justice, but the fine print told a different story. The settlement had no admission of wrongdoing by the NFL. It capped damages for future claims, and it limited compensation for players with certain neurological conditions, leaving many without the help they desperately needed. Even the way the payout was structured revealed an intent to protect the league's bottom line, ensuring that the financial hit was spread over decades rather than confronting the full scope of the damage at once. For owners, The concussion crisis was never just about health. It was about liability. Every admission of risk threatened to undermine the image of football as a manageable, thrilling sport. If parents pulled their kids out of youth leagues, if sponsors grew wary, if fans began to see the game as too dangerous, the empire could collapse. So owners balanced on a razor's edge, acknowledging just enough to appear responsive, but never so much that the foundation of their billion-dollar enterprise was shaken. In private, some owners admitted what they wouldn't say publicly. Former Dallas Cowboys executive Gil Brandt once remarked that in the earlier days of football, we just didn't know. But the lawsuits proved that by the 1990s, knowledge was there and it was being ignored. Journalists like Alan Schwartz of the New York Times exposed damning details, reporting on players who had suffered multiple concussions, yet were cleared to play again within days. His reporting forced the issue into the national conversation, but the NFL responded with predictable deflection, often suggesting that more research was needed. Even now, after all the lawsuits and settlements, questions linger. Players continue to suffer, diagnoses continue to pile up, and the league continues to evolve its narrative to protect itself. The concussion settlement created a precedent, but it didn't create closure. Many players and families still feel betrayed, believing that no dollar figure can account for the years of pain, confusion, and lost identity brought on by hidden truths. And when I reflect on this chapter of the NFL story, what strikes me most isn't just the science or the legal battles, it's the silence. The long years when players sat in locker rooms with headaches that wouldn't fade, confusion that wouldn't lift, and a creeping fear they couldn't articulate. They looked for answers and were told everything was fine. They trusted the shield, only to learn later that the shield had been protecting itself, not them. The concussion lawsuits tore open a wound the NFL had spent decades stitching shut. And while settlements and policy changes have followed, the deeper truth remains. The owners knew more than they admitted, and their decisions shaped the destinies of thousands of men. Behind every statistic is a family broken, a legacy cut short, a human being left to wonder whether the game they loved ultimately betrayed them. This wasn't just negligence, it was a strategy one more chapter in the long history of dirty deals made behind the scenes. And as we move forward in this story, we'll see that this culture of concealment, denial, and profit-first thinking didn't stop with concussions. It was part of a larger pattern, woven into the very fabric of the NFL's rise to dominance. I've often thought about how the NFL was never just a game of inches on the field. It was a game of inches in boardrooms, contracts, and broadcast towers. By the time the concussion lawsuits were tightening around the league's throat, owners had already mastered their next battlefield: television. What started as a way to simply beam games into living rooms became the lifeline of the league, a financial juggernaut that no ticket sale, no merchandise line could ever compete with. And yet, hidden beneath the dazzling Sunday Night Football intros and billion-dollar rights packages, there was a shadowy layer of maneuvering deals cut in quiet corners. Agreements that bound cities and fans to a machine they could never escape. Television wasn't just money, it was power. In the 1960s, when the league secured an antitrust exemption to collectively negotiate TV contracts, it laid the groundwork for the NFL to become America's true national pastime. By the 1970s and 80s, networks were paying sums that seemed unimaginable. But those checks weren't spread evenly. They empowered the owners in ways that the players could never touch. "We don't sell the game," one longtime executive admitted off record. "We sell the rights to the game, and that's where the real profit is." By the early 1990s, owners realized something crucial. Television money was recession-proof. Ticket sales could dip, teams could underperform. But as long as networks needed live sports and advertisers would pay anything to be attached to it, the NFL could grow unchecked. This is when hidden deals became most dangerous. Owners tied broadcast contracts not just to league-wide distribution, but to personal leverage. They knew the networks needed exclusivity, and they squeezed every ounce of value out of that desperation. CBS, Fox, NBC, ESP, on each fought for the NFL-like kingdoms, fighting over territory. And with every bidding war, the owners' coffers grew fatter. But what the public rarely saw was how broadcast revenue changed the balance of power internally. The salary cap may have given the illusion of parity, but broadcast rights created a financial moat that guaranteed the owners could never lose, no matter how poorly a team performed, no matter how empty the stadium. They still collected a massive slice of television money. It insulated them from risk. A failing franchise was still a profitable franchise, so long as the league held those TV contracts hostage to exclusivity. The players felt the squeeze in ways they couldn't articulate. "We put our bodies on the line every Sunday," a veteran once told me, "but the biggest money we'll never see. It goes straight upstairs before it ever touches us." And he was right. For decades, television rights outpaced player salaries at an exponential rate. The union could fight for bigger contracts, but the ceiling was always capped by what owners chose to reveal. Behind closed doors, some executives admitted the books were designed so that the network's money looked like league profit, rather than player revenue. Accounting magic. Legal camouflage. And then came the digital revolution. Suddenly, the NFL wasn't just tied to network contracts, it was selling slices of itself to streaming platforms, mobile carriers, and international broadcasters. Billions upon billions in new money, all flowing upward. Yet every announcement was couched as growth for the game, never as growth for the owners' empires. When Amazon signed on to carry Thursday Night Football, the public saw innovation. Insiders saw another lock, another gate, another stream of cash immune from player demands. The manipulation didn't stop at revenue. Stadium deals already funded by taxpayers were tied directly to broadcast exposure. Cities were told that if they didn't build or renovate stadiums, their team could lose prime-time opportunities. Translation: your city pays, or your team becomes invisible on national television. That wasn't just leverage. It was blackmail by broadcast. Consider Los Angeles. For decades, the league deliberately kept the second largest media market without a team. Why? Because its absence made television contracts more lucrative. Networks feared losing access to the nation's second largest audience, so they bid higher, desperate to secure the games that mattered most. And when the league finally returned to LA with two franchises, it wasn't just about football, which was about planting a flag in a market that made broadcast rights skyrocket even further. Every move was calculated. Expansion wasn't just sport, it was broadcast strategy. London games, Mexico City showcases, even talk of permanent overseas franchises each, one designed to dangle new markets in front of networks hungry for exclusivity. It's not about whether fans in London care about football, one media analyst said bluntly. It's about whether Sky Sports or the BBC is willing to outbid their rivals for a piece of the shield. And while the money rained down, fans unknowingly became pawns. Television blackouts rules that punished local markets if games didn't sell out were another weapon. Families who couldn't afford tickets were barred from watching their own team on TV, all to force stadium attendance. For decades, this policy was defended as protecting the fan experience. In reality, it was another method of squeezing loyalty into dollars. The blackout rule may have been phased out in recent years, but its legacy remains. Fans conditioned to believe they must sacrifice for access. For players, television brought exposure, fame, and endorsement deals, but it also brought surveillance. Every angle, every slow-motion replay, every mistake broadcast in high definition. Their careers became spectacles, their mistakes immortalized, while the owners sat in luxury suites counting checks. The narrative was crafted carefully. The players were warriors, but the league was eternal. Players came and went. Owners remained the guardians of the game, the beneficiaries of a machine no one else could control. The lawsuits over concussions revealed part of this machine. Court documents showed how much the league had invested in preserving the image of the game, because television contracts depended on it. A tarnished product meant weakened leverage. And so, the owners fought not just against players, but against truth itself, protecting broadcast money as if it were oxygen. In a way, it was. Without television, the NFL doesn't exist in the form we know it. With it, they became untouchable. I've come to realize that every dollar tied to television rights was another stitch in the owner's armor. The players fought on the field, but the real battle was fought in contracts, broadcast towers, and corporate boardrooms. Fans tuned in for touchdowns. Owners tuned in for deposits. That disconnect is what kept the machine alive, what made it unstoppable. Because in the end, television was never just a deal. It was a weapon. It was leverage. It was the invisible hand that built the empire and ensured that no matter how many players broke, no matter how many lawsuits loomed, the NFL's most powerful figures never had to worry about losing. If the television deals gave NFL owners the keys to American households, then merchandising and licensing gave them the power to live inside those households on shirts, hats, lunchboxes, video games, and later, in the digital space of fantasy football. By the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the league was no longer just a Sunday product. It had become a year-round brand. And like every previous chapter of this story, the owners were careful to ensure that when this new stream of money exploded, it flowed through their pipelines first, leaving the players scrambling to secure only what little they were allowed. It started innocently enough. In the early days, fans bought pennants, simple caps, or maybe jackets stitched with their team colors. These weren't billion-dollar markets, they were souvenirs. But as the league grew under the television spotlight, the appetite for branded gear turned into an obsession. Kids wanted to wear their favorite quarterback's jersey to school. Adults wanted to display allegiance with apparel. In effect, fandom became wearable. And the owners, who had already mastered the art of collective bargaining among themselves, realized they could consolidate licensing, just like they had consolidated TV rights. So in 1963, the league quietly established NFL Properties, a little-known subsidiary at first, but one that would turn into a goldmine. The owners agreed that instead of each team licensing its logos separately, all trademarks and merchandising rights would run through this one central arm. That meant companies like Nike, Wilson, or Reebok didn't negotiate with the Cowboys or the Packers or the Raiders individually. They negotiated with the NFL itself. The result? A unified, league-wide licensing machine that allowed owners to split revenues equally, regardless of market size. On the surface, it seemed fair. Smaller market teams like Green Bay or Buffalo loved the equal split because it gave them financial muscle they couldn't dream of on their own. But underneath, the control was unmistakable. The league, not the players, owned the branding of professional football. And when you control the brand, you control not just the profits, but the narrative of who matters and who doesn't. For players, this arrangement was a double-edged sword. Fans weren't just buying football gear. They were buying the identity of specific stars. A kid didn't beg for a plain NFL shirt. He begged for a Don Marino jersey, or later, a Tom Brady one. Yet, the way the contracts were structured, individual players saw only a fraction of the profits that their names and numbers generated. Jerseys carried their likenesses, video games digitized their movements, and trading cards immortalized their images, but all under licensing agreements negotiated by the league. This became most obvious when EA Sports' Madden NFL franchise emerged. By the early 2000s, Madden was more than a game, it was a cultural event. Every release was a phenomenon, bringing in hundreds of millions. But the players who filled the rosters, whose speed ratings and signature styles made the game realistic, weren't directly profiting from that. The NFL Players Association did negotiate a licensing deal with EA. But just like television money and merchandising splits, the terms favored the collective and, by extension, the league. For most rank-and-file players, the checks they saw from Madden were barely noticeable. Meanwhile, EA wrote massive contracts to the NFL itself to secure exclusivity. The exclusivity mattered. In 2004, EA locked down a deal to become the sole licensed football video game, shutting out competitors like 2K Sports. The cost of that deal ran into the hundreds of millions. But who benefited most? The owners. They were guaranteed years of licensing money without the risk of competitive bidding lowering the value. And yet, the players whose likenesses gave Madden its realism were in no position to demand a bigger cut. Their union was outmaneuvered again, as the league had cleverly separated the value of the logos and trademarks from the players' likenesses. The players might own their names and numbers individually, but the NFL owned the shield, and the shield was where the biggest checks landed. This tug of war over identity extended into the world of fantasy football. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, fantasy leagues had transformed from office pools into billion-dollar digital industries. Companies like Yahoo, ESPN, and CBS Sports built platforms where fans could draft real players to score points each week. It was a cultural revolution, turning fans into pseudo-general managers and driving engagement with the NFL to unprecedented levels. Every touchdown, every yard gained, every reception meant points, and fantasy players glued themselves to games they might not otherwise watch. The NFL, once wary of fantasy football, realized its potential and moved quickly to monetize. Broadcasts began featuring fantasy stats on screen. The league cut deals with data companies to sell real-time statistics directly to fantasy platforms. Again, the owners made sure the league, not the players, was the primary gatekeeper of this goldmine. The irony? Fantasy football transformed individual players into micro-celebrities. A backup running back who had a breakout game suddenly mattered to millions of fantasy owners. But in financial terms, that surge in popularity didn't change his paycheck. He was still locked under his NFL contract, while the league and its partners raked in cash from the obsession with player performance. The same story unfolded with apparel. In the mid-2000s, Reebok secured a 10-year exclusive deal to produce all NFL uniforms and sideline gear. The contract was worth hundreds of millions. For fans, it meant authenticity. Every jersey you bought was officially licensed. For the league, it meant another guaranteed stream of revenue. But again, how much of that trickled down to the players? Only slivers, negotiated in collective bargaining agreements that always seemed tilted toward the owner's interests. And when Nike took over in 2012, the deal was even bigger and the branding even stronger. The swoosh wasn't just on uniforms. It was woven into the NFL's very identity. The rollout of alternate jerseys, color rush designs, and endless merchandise variations created a frenzy of consumer spending. The league positioned itself as more than a sports brand. It was a lifestyle, a fashion statement. Yet the players wearing those uniforms warranty getting royalties for every fan jersey sold, with their names stitched on the back. The league made sure of that by bundling everything under centralized contracts. If the salary cap was the owner's weapon of the 1990s, then licensing and merchandising were their weapons of the 2000s and beyond. Both operated under the same principle: control the pool, centralize the revenue, and dictate the terms. The NFL didn't just sell football. It sold the illusion of intimacy between players and fans. An illusion made profitable because the players had no real control over their own images. Consider the lawsuits that emerged from retired players in the late 2000s. Groups of former athletes sued both the NFL and the Players Association, arguing that their likenesses were used in video games and merchandise without fair compensation. The league's defense: technicalities buried in contracts. The message was clear. The machine was too big, too centralized, and too well protected to be meaningfully challenged. For the fans, all this maneuvering was invisible. They saw only the products: the jerseys, the games, the fantasy scores. They celebrated the access, the immersion, the thrill of having football everywhere. But behind the curtain, The NFL's dirty deals ensured that while fans believed they were celebrating the players, they were really enriching the owners who had built walls around every single revenue stream. Merchandising and licensing weren't just side hustles for the NFL. They became the pillars of the modern league, ensuring that the shield was always front and center. Owners didn't have to worry about a bad season destroying profits. Even if the team lost on the field, the merchandise still sold. The video games still shipped, the fantasy leagues still thrived. And that guaranteed stability, the one thing every business empire craves. In the end, this wasn't just about football gear. It was about the commodification of identity, the transformation of human athletes into trademarks, and the consolidation of cultural power into corporate hands. Television had made football the most watched sport in America. Licensing and merchandising made it unavoidable. And once again, the players who sweat, skill, and sacrifice made the product worth buying were left fighting for scraps from the empire they themselves had built. The game had always been bigger than the field. By the 2010s, the NFL had perfected the formula. Broadcast money, licensing, merchandising, stadium deals, all meticulously orchestrated to maximize revenue and minimize risk. But the next frontier wasn't in uniforms or ticket sales or even television. It was in the culture of play itself, fantasy football, gambling partnerships, and ultimately legalized sports betting. And once again, the league proved it could turn passion into profit while controlling the rules of the game from behind closed doors. Fantasy football had begun as a niche obsession, a quiet rebellion in offices and basements. Early leagues were simple, scoring points for touchdowns and yards, traded among friends who obsessively tracked stats in spreadsheets. But as the 2000s progressed, the phenomenon exploded. Millions of Americans became pseudo-general managers, obsessively following injuries, matchups, and player trends. By 2010, fantasy football was no longer just a hobby, it was a cultural and economic juggernaut, generating billions in participation fees, online subscriptions, and advertising revenue. The NFL, which had once treated fantasy football with wary skepticism, quickly recognized its potential. They didn't just tolerate it, they monetized it. Platforms like Yahoo, ESPN, and CBS Sports paid for league-approved data feeds. Statistics that fans once computed manually were now sold as packaged premium products. Fantasy stats appeared on broadcasts, apps, and websites, turning ordinary games into micro-events for millions of engaged participants. Every reception, sack, or fumble could now influence hundreds of fantasy rosters across the country. The stakes for fans weren't just emotional, they were financial, and the league was positioned to take a cut at every turn. It was brilliant hand, mercilessly efficient. By centralizing the data rights, the NFL ensured that any company wanting to profit from fantasy football had to pay the league, not the players. The stars themselves remained constrained by contracts that didn't account for this new revenue stream. A player who dominated fantasy leagues week after week generated untold wealth for the league and media partners, yet saw little of it himself beyond standard salary and endorsements negotiated separately. It was the same pattern repeated over decades. The labor created the product, the owners and league captured the profits. Then came the next, even more lucrative frontier: sports betting. For decades, gambling had been largely illegal or tightly restricted, and the NFL, like most professional leagues, denied any official involvement. But behind the scenes, conversations were already happening. Owners, ever aware of risk and reward, recognized a new opportunity. Legalized betting could be a revenue stream unlike anything else. Unlike television rights or merchandising, it could create continuous engagement, tie fans to the game 24/7, and funnel billions directly into league-sanctioned partnerships. In 2018, the Supreme Court struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act (PASPA), effectively allowing states to legalize sports betting. For the NFL, it was a turning point. What had once been a murky gray market suddenly became a legal goldmine. Within months, the league signed deals with DraftKings, FanDuel, Caesars, and others official partnerships that ensured the league itself would profit from every bet placed under its banner. Unlike fantasy data, where they had monetized indirect fan engagement, sports betting tied the financial stakes directly to the game. Every field goal, every turnover, every quarterback sack was now a microtransaction, and the league would take a cut. These partnerships were tightly controlled. The NFL didn't just sell access to betting companies, it dictated terms, branding, and even the messaging around gambling. Players were restricted in how they could talk about betting publicly. Fans were given the illusion of freedom. Bet here, bet there, choose your provider. But behind the scenes, the league ensured that revenue flowed upward, controlled by owners and executives who had engineered this empire over decades. As one insider explained, "We don't just sell football, we sell engagement, and engagement is cash." It was, in many ways, the perfect extension of the league's existing model. Stadiums built with taxpayer dollars, exclusive television contracts. Merchandising monopolies had taught owners how to centralize profit streams while insulating themselves from risk. Sports betting simply added another pillar. And like the others, it came at a cost to the players, to the fans, and even to the integrity of the game. Players found themselves navigating a new ethical landscape. While the league insisted on strict rules prohibiting athletes from betting on games, the increased visibility of gambling influenced public perception, media coverage, and the pressure of performance. Every interception, every fumble, every spike in fantasy stats could now be monetized, raising questions about player behavior and the subtle ways the game itself was being manipulated by the invisible hand of commerce. And while fantasy and betting made stars household names, it did little to enhance their financial security relative to the billions flowing to owners. For fans, the promise was intoxicating. They could now actively participate in the drama of the NFL in ways that felt immediate and meaningful. Fantasy leagues created obsessive devotion. Betting offered high stakes and adrenaline. And yet, this engagement came with hidden strings. Every dollar spent on a legal sportsbook or subscription service effectively enriched the league and its partners. The fans were complicit, willingly fueling a machine that thrived on their passion while shielding the players from the full economic upside. The economic impact was staggering. By 2022, sports betting alone was generating billions annually in revenue. DraftKings, FanDuel, and other platforms partnered officially with the league, paying licensing fees, integrating league branding, and providing data streams that ensured the NFL maintained control. And unlike ticket sales, which fluctuated based on team performance, or merchandising, which depended on consumer trends, betting revenue was consistent, predictable, and expanding rapidly as more states legalized wagering. Owners had found another guaranteed stream of profit, protected by legality, branding, and exclusivity, the same formula that had worked for television and merchandising decades before. Yet there were consequences that extended beyond the balance sheet. Addiction, financial risk, and ethical concerns followed. Players were caught in the crossfire between strict league rules and the hyper-commercialized culture surrounding gambling. Families of fans often faced the very real consequences of compulsive betting, while the league maintained its image as a responsible steward of the sport. The irony was unmistakable. An empire built on controlled risk, calculated engagement, and centralized profit now profited from risk in the personal lives of fans themselves. This duality of vast financial gain versus human cost has been the story of the NFL for decades. From the earliest days of salary caps to stadium deals, television monopolies, and merchandising empires, the league has repeatedly turned passion into profit, often at the expense of the very people who make it possible. Fantasy football and sports betting were simply the latest evolution, a modern extension of the owner's playbook. Control the market, centralize revenue, protect the brand, and ensure the players and fans generate wealth without disrupting the system. For the players, the story is familiar. Every innovation, whether it's fantasy football or betting partnerships, was accompanied by rules that ensured the economic windfall primarily benefited the league and its owners. And yet, the cultural impact was undeniable. Players became icons in new ways, their names driving millions in virtual drafts and digital points. Their performances generated gambling excitement, media traffic, and merchandise sales. But the division of financial rewards remained uneven, a reflection of systemic design that favored those at the top. And as with television and merchandising, the league carefully controlled the narrative. Media campaigns framed betting and fantasy participation as entertainment, engagement, and community building. The risks, financial, psychological, or ethical, were downplayed or compartmentalized. Fans saw games as thrilling and immersive. Owners saw another empire being built beneath the public gaze, one structured so that the more people invested emotionally, financially, and culturally, the more the league itself would benefit. Looking back, it's clear that fantasy football, gambling partnerships, and legalized sports betting were not mere fads. They were the logical extension of decades of strategic control. The NFL didn't simply adapt to these trends. It absorbed them into a pre-existing framework designed for profit maximization and risk insulation. And in doing so, the owners reinforced a fundamental truth. The league's survival and growth depended less on individual games or seasons, and more on the carefully constructed architecture of commerce law and perception that ensured the shield remained untouchable. The system worked. Fans spent billions. Players competed under stricter financial and contractual constraints. Owners grew wealthier and more insulated. And yet, beneath the surface, questions lingered about fairness, exploitation, and the human cost of turning passion into an empire. Fantasy football and sports betting weren't inherently harmful. They were exciting, immersive, and culturally transformative. But in the hands of the NFL's owners, they became yet another instrument to centralize wealth, manage risk, and maintain control, a pattern that has defined the league for decades. In many ways, Batch 13 is the culmination of a long line of owner strategies: television rights, stadium deals, merchandising, and now gambling. Each innovation exploited human desire, our fascination with competition, our obsession with stats, our thrill for stakes, and converted it into a structured, controlled revenue stream. Each also revealed the same underlying reality. The league, not the players, dictated the terms of engagement, the distribution of rewards, and the boundaries of access. This chapter also underscores a persistent tension in the NFL's story between culture and commerce, human passion and corporate control. Fantasy football and sports betting brought unprecedented engagement, but they also highlighted the systemic imbalance. Owners captured the lion's share of wealth. Players were constrained by contracts, and fans became co-conspirators in their own exploitation. It's a modern reflection of a pattern that stretches back to the earliest days of the Lego relentless drive to centralize profit while shaping perception, one innovation at a time. By the end of this segment, it becomes evident. The NFL didn't merely survive the legal and cultural changes surrounding gambling. It thrived, transforming potential disruption into yet another fortress of control. Fantasy football and sports betting were not anomalies. They were milestones in a decades-long strategy to consolidate wealth, influence culture, and secure the league's power. And in the shadows of this empire, the players and fans remained essential to the machine, generating wealth, passion, spectacle, while the owners captured nearly all of the reward. By the late 2000s, the NFL had already mastered domestic domination television contracts, stadium leverage, merchandising, fantasy football, and legalized sports betting had all cemented owners' financial empires. But for the league, resting on U.S. borders was never enough. Global markets beckoned, offering untapped audiences and another layer of control over fans and revenue streams. International expansion became the next frontier, a carefully calculated effort to turn American football into a worldwide brand, monetized, and managed with the same precision that had defined every move of the owner's playbook. The first experiments were modest, almost symbolic. NFL games were occasionally played abroad as exhibition matches, London, Mexico City, Toronto, but for years they remained novelties. Still, the league quietly gathered data, studying attendance, broadcast reach, merchandise sales, and cultural reception. They recognized something fundamental. While football was rooted in American culture, its appeal could be translated into a global spectacle, but only if the product was packaged correctly. And here, too, the owners saw opportunity. The same model that worked domestically control the product. Centralized revenue, managed perception could be applied internationally. By 2007, the NFL launched the International Series, an ambitious plan to play regular season games in London. The first match, featuring the New York Giants and Miami Dolphins, was sold out within hours. Fans lined streets around Wembley Stadium, many traveling across Europe to witness a piece of American sports culture firsthand. What appeared as goodwill and global outreach was, in reality, a strategic play. Ticket sales, local sponsorships, and broadcast rights in Europe generated a new revenue stream while further cementing the NFL's image as a global powerhouse. Merchandising followed closely behind. NFL properties began licensing team logos and apparel to European markets, ensuring that jerseys, caps, and other branded gear were available worldwide. Fans abroad could buy the same official merchandise that U.S. fans cherished, creating a sense of parity and legitimacy while providing the league with untapped profits. Centralized licensing ensured that every international dollar flowed into the same coffers as domestic revenue, maintaining the owner's pattern of control. The players' share remained limited, echoing decades of precedent. They provided the labor and the image, but the financial reward was primarily reserved for the league. Television and streaming rights abroad became another instrument of influence. The NFL partnered with major broadcasters across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, ensuring that games were available live and on demand, often bundled with premium sports packages. These contracts guarantee the league a consistent revenue stream, insulated from fluctuations in U.S. viewership or local market performance. International fans had access to the spectacle, but only on the league's terms, often at prices designed to maximize profit. The model was familiar. Centralize control, monetize engagement, and leverage scarcity to maintain value. The league also nurtured localized content to appeal to foreign audiences. European broadcasts incorporated commentary tailored to local sensibilities. Marketing campaigns highlighted star players in culturally resonant ways, and social media engagement promoted an NFL lifestyle rather than just the sport. In Asia, the league partnered with mobile apps and digital streaming platforms to reach younger, tech-savvy fans. Global branding became an exercise not merely in exposure, but in control shaping how football was consumed, understood and valued in different cultural contexts. Expansion wasn't limited to Europe and Asia. Mexico City became a regular site for NFL games. Starting in 2016, tapping into a vast, passionate market. The games were sold out within minutes, often at prices significantly higher than U.S. ticket averages, creating a direct infusion of revenue while simultaneously testing the viability of permanent foreign franchises. Local broadcasters paid premium fees for rights, while merchandise and concessions added layers of profit. From the league's perspective, the model was simple. Create scarcity, maintain exclusivity, and ensure every transaction reinforced the owner's financial and cultural dominance. Even the digital landscape became part of the strategy. International apps, fantasy football platforms, and betting integrations were localized to increase participation while maintaining centralized oversight. Fans outside the U.S. could now engage in fantasy leagues tied to American players, purchase official merchandise, or participate in legal betting, all under league-controlled platforms. Each interaction, each dollar, and each click funneled directly into structures designed to protect the league's interests while fostering global fandom. In essence, the NFL didn't just export games, it exported a meticulously controlled ecosystem, ensuring that international expansion mirrored domestic revenue centralization. Global branding also included strategic partnerships with corporations, airlines, telecommunications companies, and tech firms. Sponsors wanted access to international audiences, and the NFL provided it in exchange for lucrative contracts. These sponsorships extended far beyond simple game day signage. They included co-branded marketing campaigns, digital activations, and merchandise teams, all designed to create a sense of NFL ubiquity. Owners had once again leveraged scarcity and exclusivity to ensure that fans, whether in London, Mexico City, or Tokyo, consumed the league on terms that maximized profit. For the players, international expansion was both a thrill and another layer of entrapment. They traveled further, played in exotic locations, and represented American football on a global stage. But their compensation and benefits remained constrained. The league negotiated travel accommodations, per diem costs, and appearance fees tightly, ensuring that the economic upside from global expansion accrued primarily to the league and its owners. Once again, the labor created the spectacle. The managers controlled the profit. The cultural impact of international expansion was significant. Millions of new fans developed emotional attachment to teams they might never see in person, deepening brand loyalty and engagement. The NFL wasn't just a game anymore, was a global phenomenon, integrated into international media, merchandise, and digital culture. Social media amplified this effect, with star players becoming global personalities, generating engagement that translated directly into revenue streams controlled by the league. Yet, beneath the excitement, the strategy mirrored earlier patterns of control. Just as television deals, stadium financing, licensing, fantasy football, and gambling had been engineered to centralize power and profit, international expansion was another example of the owner's playbook. Fans were encouraged to participate, spend, and engage, but only on the league's terms. Players were showcased as global icons. Yet their economic reward was disproportionately small relative to the revenue they helped generate, and governments and local markets, eager to host games, were often persuaded to subsidize stadiums or infrastructure, echoing the same taxpayer leverage seen domestically. The NFL's international expansion also highlighted the psychological dimensions of ownership control. Fans in London or Mexico City were emotionally invested, celebrating victories, agonizing over losses, and consuming content daily. Yet the league controlled every facet of that experience. Access to broadcasts, availability of merchandise, official fantasy leagues, digital platforms, and even social media representation. Owners had effectively exported the domestic model of centralized, controlled revenue and engagement to a global stage, ensuring that the system remained robust, profitable, and insulated from disruption. Financially, the strategy paid off. By the early 2020s, international games, merchandise sales, and media rights generated hundreds of millions in additional revenue annually. But the significance went beyond numbers. The league had successfully transformed cultural fascination into a tightly controlled commercial ecosystem. Each expansion into a new market was carefully analyzed, ensuring that fans' enthusiasm translated directly into profits. Every broadcast contract, merchandising deal, and sponsorship agreement reinforced the centralized architecture of power built over decades. In many ways, this is the culmination of a pattern that stretches back to the earliest NFL owners. From the earliest days of controlling player contracts, to monopolizing television and merchandising rights, to exploiting fantasy football and betting, international expansion was simply another frontier to centralize control. It wasn't just about growing the sport, it was about monetizing passion, dictating the narrative, and ensuring that the empire, like the shield itself, remained untouchable. As I reflect on this chapter, one thing becomes clear. the NFL's global strategy is not accidental. It is the product of decades of calculated decision-making of owners who understood that every new market, every new medium, every innovation could be molded into a controlled revenue stream. Fans, whether in Chicago or London, New York or Mexico City, participate in the spectacle willingly, often unaware of the architecture that dictates access, pricing, and content. Players, likewise, are integral to the product, yet rarely fully compensated for the global empire their labor sustains. The international expansion of the NFL is more than a story of games abroad. It is a story of power, strategy, and the relentless monetization of culture. Owners turn the world into a playing field, not merely for athletic competition, but for economic dominance. The lessons are consistent. Centralize control, monetize engagement, protect the brand, and ensure that profit flows primarily upward. And as the league continues to push into new markets and platforms, it's clear that the same principles that govern domestic growth now govern its global empire, ensuring that the shield remains both omnipresent and untouchable. By the end of this segment, we see that international expansion is the latest layer in a long history of NFL owners' strategic maneuvering. From domestic television contracts and stadium deals to merchandising, fantasy football, betting, and now global branding, each initiative follows the same blueprint. Centralize power, control perception, and maximize profit. Players, fans, and local governments participate in the spectacle, while the architects of the empire owners and executives reap the overwhelming benefits. The pattern is clear. And as we approach the final chapter, it becomes impossible to ignore the totality of the system that has been constructed, its scale, and the human consequences beneath the glittering surface of the game. As we arrive at the final chapter of this saga, the pattern is unmistakable. Over decades, NFL owners have constructed a multi-layered empire: television contracts, stadium financing, licensing, and merchandising, fantasy football, gambling partnerships, and international expansion, all designed to centralize control, maximize profit, and shape culture. Each initiative seemingly independent. It's in fact a deliberate extension of a strategy that places the owners at the apex, with players, fans, and even governments as instruments in a vast, meticulously managed ecosystem. It begins with profit, because in the NFL, everything begins with money. Owners have always understood that the game itself is only the starting point. A touchdown, a sack, or a Hail Mary pass is not just a play. It is a transaction, a moment that can generate revenue through broadcast ratings, merchandise sales, fantasy scoring, or betting odds. Every mechanism from collective licensing agreements to exclusive television contracts is designed to capture the value of these moments, often long before players or fans recognize it. And while players provide the talent, skill, and spectacle, the financial levers are largely in the hands of owners. Consider the salary cap, introduced in the 1990s as a way to create competitive balance among teams. While ostensibly a measure to maintain parity, it also became a tool of financial control. Owners could manage costs predictably, ensuring that player compensation stayed within limits favorable to profit margins, even as the league's overall revenue skyrocketed. Teams in small markets, which might have struggled financially otherwise, were now protected by revenue sharing, further consolidating the power of the league over individual franchises and players. It was a clever orchestration. Parity on the field masked centralization off the field. Then came stadium deals, often leveraging taxpayer funds. Cities were encouraged or pressured to build multi-million-dollar facilities under the guise of civic pride and economic development. In reality, these stadiums became financial fortresses for the owners, generating revenue from ticket sales, concessions, premium seating, and naming rights, while the public shouldered much of the initial cost. This strategy mirrored the financial logic of the league's broader empire. Take calculated risks, minimize exposure, and maximize upside. The public investment allowed owners to reap outsized rewards, creating another layer of economic insulation. Television contracts amplified this power. the NFL now dominates the media landscape in ways few sports leagues can claim. Exclusive rights deals guarantee billions annually. Every primetime game, playoff broadcast, and Super Bowl telecast generates enormous revenue, which is split among the owners but largely insulated from players' individual bargaining power. Once again, the architecture of control is evident. The labor creates the product. The owners control the distribution and monetization. Licensing and merchandising added yet another dimension. From jerseys and caps to video games and trading cards, the league ensured that every use of its intellectual property flowed through centralized agreements, guaranteeing that profits were captured at the top. Players may have provided the face of the product, but the financial benefits were tightly controlled, even as some stars became global icons. Their compensation for their own image remained limited, underscoring a persistent imbalance. Cultural influence without proportional economic reward. Fantasy football and sports betting represent a more modern layer, transforming engagement into monetizable obsession. The proliferation of fantasy leagues, legal betting partnerships, and integrated apps made every yard gained, every touchdown scored, and every player statistic a potential revenue event. Fans, thrilled by the illusion of control, became active participants in a system that funneled wealth to the league and its partners. Players' performances were commoditized beyond the confines of their contracts, yet the owners captured the lion's share. Here, as with television, merchandising, and stadiums, human passion became a predictable, controllable cash flow. International expansion further reinforced the NFL's dominance. Global markets provided a fresh canvas on which to project the league's brand, from London to Mexico City, Tokyo to Munich. Merchandise sales, broadcast contracts, and sponsorship deals extended the financial empire beyond U.S. borders. Players became international celebrities, while fans worldwide consumed a highly curated version of American football designed for profitability. In every sense, the same principles applied. Centralization of revenue, control of access, and leverage over labor and consumption. Through all these strategies, one tension persists: the human cost. Players, the very architects of the spectacle, often bear the brunt of physical, emotional, and financial strain. Injuries, particularly concussions and long-term neurological issues, remain a silent testament to the risks taken for entertainment and profit. While some compensation exists, including settlements from concussion lawsuits and union-negotiated benefits, these are reactive measures in a system primarily structured to protect owners' financial interests. Players' welfare is secondary to the revenue streams that they make possible. Fans, too, are caught in a delicate balance. They experience exhilaration, identity, and community through fandom. Yet each interaction, buying tickets, purchasing jerseys, engaging in fantasy or betting feeds, a system designed for maximum financial extraction. There is joy, but it is commoditized joy, carefully packaged to maintain loyalty while capturing as much economic value as possible. Engagement is both genuine and instrumental, a reflection of the NFL's mastery in shaping culture for profit. And yet, this system is not without complexity or nuance. The league's empire, while lucrative, is built on cooperation, trust, and mutual fascination. Players and fans contribute meaningfully to its success, and the spectacle of professional football would be impossible without their participation. Owners' power is immense, but it is exercised in a landscape that depends on emotional and cultural investment. This is why the league invests in branding, media narratives, community outreach, and global marketing tools that maintain the delicate balance between control and authenticity. Reflecting on the cumulative impact of these strategies, one sees a pattern. The NFL's architecture of power is iterative, strategic, and meticulously layered. Every new innovation, be it a salary cap, a stadium deal, television rights, merchandising, fantasy leagues, betting partnerships, or international expansion, has been integrated into a system designed to centralize authority, maximize profit, and shape perception. The labor of players and the passion of fans are harnessed, monetized, and directed, often without full recognition of their central role in creating value. Yet, despite the clear advantages to owners, cracks appear. Public scrutiny over player safety, labor disputes, ethical questions about gambling, and debates over stadium subsidies reveal tensions inherent in a system designed for control. Fans and players are increasingly aware of the dynamics, pushing for transparency, equitable revenue sharing, and better protections. The empire is vast, but it is not invulnerable. These tensions reflect a fundamental truth. Any system that balances profit against human cost must continuously negotiate legitimacy, perception, and consent. In the end, the story of NFL ownership is a story of strategy, foresight, and relentless pursuit of control. From the earliest consolidation of team power to the modern era of global branding and betting empires, the owners have demonstrated an unparalleled capacity to translate human fascination into predictable, controlled profit. The patterns are clear, the methods sophisticated, and the consequences profound. Players risk health, fans risk money and devotion, and governments risk public funds all, while the league consolidates influence and wealth. As I reflect on this landscape, the complexity becomes almost poetic. The NFL is not merely a sport. It is a cultural and financial organism, shaped by history, law, media, economics, and human behavior. Its success is inseparable from the labor of athletes and the engagement of fans. Yet its structure ensures that those at the top reap the most enduring rewards. The human stories, the triumphs, the injuries, the sacrifices are woven into the financial and strategic fabric of the league. A reminder that behind every touchdown and broadcast rating lies a carefully orchestrated machine. The culmination of these strategies reveals the full scope of systemic power. Owners have built an empire that controls nearly every aspect of the product, from production to consumption, from local markets to global audiences, from live attendance to virtual participation, from direct engagement to ancillary betting and fantasy ecosystems. The architecture is both resilient and adaptive, able to incorporate new trends while safeguarding central authority. Yet this consolidation of power is not abstracted, has real implications for the people who create the spectacle and the audiences who invest emotionally and financially. Ultimately, Batch 15 underscores the paradox at the heart of the NFL. The league thrives because of its players and fans. Yet it is designed to extract maximum value from them while maintaining centralized control. The owner's influence extends across economic, cultural, and psychological dimensions, creating an empire that is both impressive and ethically complex. For those inside and outside the league, the challenge is clear: how to participate, benefit, and protect human interests in a system engineered for profit and centralization. As the curtain falls on this chapter of NFL history, the lessons are unambiguous. The strategies are deliberate, the patterns consistent, and the consequences tangible. Owners have leveraged every opportunity: salary caps, stadium deals, television rights, merchandising, fantasy leagues, betting partnerships, and global expansion to construct a system that consolidates wealth, shapes culture, and controls the game beyond the field. Players and fans remain central to the spectacle, yet their role in the economic hierarchy is often constrained. The tension between human cost and financial gain is woven into every facet of the league, a structural reality that endures even as the sport continues to grow in popularity and reach. The NFL is a masterclass in organizational strategy, a cautionary tale about centralized control, and a living testament to the power of structured influence over culture, labor, and commerce. The game in its spectacle remains electrifying. But behind the lights, the profits, and the roar of the crowd lies an intricate, layered system, a reminder that every touchdown, every broadcast, every jersey, every fantasy point, and every bet is a piece of a vast empire, meticulously built, carefully maintained, and relentlessly optimized for those at the top. As we step back from the intricate web of strategies, deals, and cultural maneuvers that define the NFL, one thing becomes crystal clear. The league is far more than a collection of games, statistics, and highlight reels. It is a masterclass in influence, a system meticulously constructed to extract value, control perception, and centralize authority. Over decades, owners have transformed football into an empire, leveraging every innovation: salary caps, stadium deals, television rights, merchandising, fantasy leagues, betting partnerships, and international expansion to consolidate power and secure long-term profit. Yet beneath this impressive architecture lies a tension that has defined the league since its earliest days: the delicate balance between profit, the welfare of players, and the engagement of fans. Players, the physical and emotional backbone of the game, risk their bodies, their health, and sometimes their futures to generate the spectacle. Fans invest their time, energy, emotion, and money, often unaware of the underlying mechanics that direct the flow of value upward. The owner's strategies are both brilliant and ruthless in their efficiency, creating a system where human passion fuels economic power, while the architects of the empire maintain centralized control. Reflecting on decades of evolution, it is impossible to ignore the continuity of strategy. From the earliest days of controlling player contracts, owners understood that the game itself could be leveraged as an economic instrument. The introduction of the salary cap ensured predictable financial boundaries while maintaining competitive theater on the field. Stadium deals, often subsidized by taxpayer funds, transformed municipal infrastructure into private profit engines. Television contracts turned each game into a global event monetized with precision. And licensing and merchandising captured the cultural and symbolic power of players' images. Fantasy football and legalized sports betting represent the modern extensions of this model, transforming engagement into quantifiable revenue streams. Fans, excited by participation and the illusion of control, generate predictable, measurable profits through apps, leagues, and betting platforms. Every yard, touchdown, and statistic becomes a commodity, monetized and centrally managed. Players continue to perform, sometimes at great personal cost. Yet the financial upside is overwhelmingly captured by the league and its owners. The lessons here are both technical and human. The NFL is a system designed to harness passion for economic efficiency. International expansion amplifies this narrative, extending the same principles to markets far beyond U.S. borders. London, Mexico City, Tokyo, Munich, and other cities have hosted regular season games. Integrated broadcasting, merchandising, sponsorships, and local engagement, creating revenue streams that mirror domestic mechanisms. Players are global ambassadors. Fans are global participants, yet the economic and structural rules remain consistent. Centralized control, maximum monetization, and strategic influence over consumption. Every element of the spectacle: viewership, merchandise, digital interaction is designed to flow profitably to the top. The human dimension of these strategies cannot be understated. Players' physical and mental health is constantly tested. Concussions, long-term injuries, and chronic conditions are all part of the cost of producing the spectacle. Legal settlements, collective bargaining agreements, and enhanced benefits address some consequences. Yet they are reactive measures within a system primarily engineered for owners' advantage. Fans, too, face subtle consequences. The lure of fantasy leagues, sports betting, and constant engagement fosters emotional and financial investment, sometimes at the cost of personal stability. And governments, persuaded by the promise of civic pride and economic stimulation, often bear financial burdens for stadium construction and infrastructure. The NFL's success is inseparable from these human investments. Yet the architecture ensures the largest share of reward flows upward. One of the most striking elements of this system is its adaptability. The league has evolved with technology, legal changes, and cultural trends. Television contracts, once the pinnacle of revenue generation, have been supplemented by streaming platforms and digital content. Fantasy football and legalized betting have expanded fan engagement and monetization in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. International expansion has broadened the league's footprint, creating new markets and revenue streams while cultivating a global fan culture. At every turn, the NFL has demonstrated a capacity not only to adapt but to absorb disruption into its centralized model of control. But the brilliance of this system carries profound ethical and social implications. The league's mechanisms often place players and fans in positions of asymmetric power. Athletes risk their health to produce content that fuels owners' wealth, while fans participate in systems that convert passion into profit. Even as engagement grows, the distribution of economic benefits remains uneven. The NFL's empire is a testament to strategic efficiency, yet it also illuminates structural inequalities embedded within professional sports. As we consider the sum of these strategies, a pattern emerges that is both instructive and cautionary. The NFL's history is not merely a chronology of games, championships, and star players. It is a story of systemic power, carefully calibrated over decades. Owners have mastered a balance between spectacle and control, entertainment and monetization, culture and commerce. Every innovation, from salary caps to global expansion, has reinforced this balance, creating a multi-layered system in which each element interacts to preserve authority, maximize profit, and protect the league's brand. Reflecting on the player's role, the tension is stark. They are simultaneously the foundation and the exploited element of the system. Their labor produces the product. Their skills generate the spectacle, and their health and well-being are constantly at risk. Legal actions, such as concussion lawsuits, highlight the gaps between the value created by players and the protections afforded to them. Even when settlements or benefits are provided, they serve more as mitigation than equitable recognition, underscoring the persistent imbalance between labor and control. Fans, too, inhabit a complex relationship with the league. Their passion is genuine, their loyalty unwavering. Yet every interaction to kit purchases, merchandise, fantasy participation, betting is part of a carefully orchestrated system that channels financial and emotional energy upward. Engagement is incentivized, structured, and monetized. Fans feel agency, excitement, and belonging. But their experience is intertwined with the architecture of control, a reality that is often invisible in the moment of joy. The broader cultural impact is undeniable. The NFL has shaped American identity, influenced global perceptions of sport, and created a cultural phenomenon with reach far beyond the field. Players become icons, storylines become rituals, and the game's rhythms structure the calendar for millions. Yet this cultural impact is inseparable from economic strategy. Media narratives, branding, digital engagement, and international expansion are tools that translate cultural fascination into measurable, controllable profit. The league's power lies not only in the spectacle, but in the ability to structure that spectacle so that every dollar, every view, and every engagement is captured within its system. Looking back over the decades, the NFL emerges as a living example of systemic orchestration. Owners have demonstrated an unparalleled capacity to convert human passion into structured profit, to turn risk into predictable returns, and to expand influence globally, while maintaining centralized control. Each innovation, salary caps, stadiums, broadcasting, merchandising, fantasy leagues, betting, international expansions, a layer in a complex system designed to capture value while managing risk and perception. The cumulative effect is an empire that is both resilient and adaptive, capable of absorbing trends, legal changes, and cultural shifts without losing centralized authority. Yet, even as we recognize the scale and sophistication of the NFL's empire, the story is incomplete without acknowledging the human stakes. Players' careers are finite, often marred by injury, with long-term consequences that extend beyond the field. Fans invest not only financially, but emotionally, shaping their identities around teams, games, and leagues. Governments invest public funds and resources, sometimes in ways that disproportionately benefit private interests. The NFL, through all its expansion and innovation, has structured these relationships to ensure the largest share of reward flows to owners. Understanding this dynamic is essential to appreciating both the magnitude of the league's success and the ethical tensions that underlie it. Ultimately, the NFL story is not one of villainy or virtue. It is one of strategy, foresight, and relentless pursuit of control. The league has harnessed human passion, talent, and cultural fascination to construct a multi-layered, resilient empire. It has demonstrated the capacity to adapt to changing legal, cultural, and technological landscapes, integrating new trends into a system of centralized authority and profit. Players and fans remain essential to this system. Yet the distribution of economic reward and control is unequal, reflecting the structural realities that underpin professional sports. Reflecting on this journey, the narrative comes full circle. The NFL is simultaneously a spectacle of athletic excellence, a cultural touchstone, and a masterclass in economic orchestration. Every touchdown, every broadcast, every jersey, every fantasy point, and every international expansion is part of a larger strategy system designed to consolidate power and maximize profit while managing risk and perception. The league thrives because of players' skill, fans' engagement, and the cultural power of sport. Yet it is precisely this combination that the owners have harnessed most effectively. The lesson is clear. The NFL is more than a game. It is an ecosystem of labor, engagement, culture, and capital. It is a machine built on human passion, meticulously engineered for profit, resilient in the face of change, and expansive in ambition. The league's owners have mastered a formula that balances spectacle, culture, and commerce, producing both extraordinary entertainment and a complex web of economic and ethical dynamics. Players perform, fans cheer, cities invest, and the league, as always, ensures that the empire grows, adapts, and endures. As we close this exploration, the final reflection is a dual recognition. First, admiration for the scale, strategy, and cultural impact of the NFL. The league has created a spectacle that transcends sport, shaping identity, community, and international recognition. Second, acknowledgement of the systemic tensions it embodies, the imbalance between labor and reward, the monetization of passion, and the ethical questions that accompany concentrated power. Understanding this duality is essential for anyone who seeks to appreciate the game in its full complexity, as both cultural phenomenon and engineered empire. The NFL, in its brilliance and ruthlessness, teaches us about human behavior, economics, and organizational strategy. It reminds us that every game, every engagement, every point scored is part of a larger system, one that is as much about control and profit as it is about competition and spectacle. Players and fans are the lifeblood of this system, yet the architecture ensures that influence and reward flow predominantly to the top. It is a story of power, strategy, and human ambition, written across decades of innovation, negotiation, and spectacle. Closing this documentary, the lesson resonates beyond football. The NFL exemplifies the interplay between passion, labor, and systemic control, between culture and commerce. It is a cautionary tale, a marvel of organization, and a lens through which we can examine larger societal dynamics. It is a story of a game transformed into an empire, and of the people, players, fans, and owners whose roles, sacrifices, and ambitions continue to shape it. The NFL is, in every sense, a reflection of the human capacity for ingenuity, organization, and profit, intertwined with the risks, costs, and consequences that define any system of power. And so, as the crowd cheers, the players take the field, and the world watches. The legacy of the league remains both spectacular and complicated, a testament to strategy, culture, and the relentless pursuit of control, where the thrill of the game coexists with the weight of systemic design, and where every victory, every loss, every engagement is a piece of a carefully orchestrated empire that continues to grow, adapt, and endure.